I'm not anybody's property.
I heard you.
Why are you doing this?
Because this ends now.
What do you want from me?
Nothing. Where to, ma'am?
They put her up for sale like she was property until a stranger slammed $600 in federal gold on the bar and asked just one question. Where to, ma'am? Hit follow right now and watch how Marin O'Shea fought for her freedom and her mother's legacy, and don't miss what comes next. The Oak Haven Saloon smelled like everything wrong with Nevada in July. Spilled whiskey baked into the floorboards. Pipe smoke thick enough to chew. The particular stink of men who hadn't seen water in a week, pressed shoulder to shoulder like cattle waiting on a brand. Marin O'Shea stood on top of an upturned whiskey barrel and kept her eyes fixed on the far wall. There was a calendar nailed up there. July 1876. A sketch of a mountain range nobody in this room had ever bothered to visit. She stared at it like it was the most important thing she'd ever seen, because if she looked at the faces below her, she would come apart. And she had promised herself, standing in the mud outside, while her father dragged her through the saloon doors by the wrist, that she would not come apart. Not here. Not in front of these men. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a length of rough hemp rope. Whoever had tied it hadn't been gentle. The fiber bit into the soft skin above her pulse, and she could already feel the burn spreading up toward her forearms. She kept her chin up anyway, jaw set, eyes dry. Behind her, her father was talking. Malachi O'Shea had what people used to call a silver tongue, back when he had something worth saying. These days, it was just noise. Smooth noise, carefully arranged, but noise all the same. Fellas, settle down now, he was saying, and she could hear the forced cheer in it, the salesman's lilt he put on whenever he needed something from someone. What we got here is a fine young woman, capable, healthy, strong stock. Her mother, God rest her, was one of the finest. Get on with it, Malachi. That was Bat Creed's voice. Flat, bored, the voice of a man who already knew how the evening was going to end. Marin had seen Bartholomew Creed twice before in her life. Once across a crowded church, once at the county land office. Both times he'd looked at her, the way he was probably looking at her now, like she was a parcel of land. He hadn't finished appraising yet. She did not look at him either. The room had maybe 40 men in it. She'd counted when they came in, a habit her mother had taught her. Count the exits, count the people, count what matters. There were 2 doors the front and a back one behind the bar that the barkeep used to haul in crates. There were 3 windows, all shuttered against the evening dust. There was one staircase running up the left wall to the second floor, where the saloon kept its private rooms. 40 men, 2 doors, no friends. She'd done the arithmetic already. $300, her father announced to the room. That's the sum. Any man willing to settle the debt and take her hand in lawful marriage walks out of here with a deal that'd make Solomon himself weep with envy. Somebody laughed. A low, ugly sound that moved through the crowd like a ripple. Marin breathed slowly through her nose. Her mother's name had been Cora O'Shea, born Cora Whitfield, and she had died 14 months ago in the spring, which meant the silver claim out on the eastern ridge, the one her mother had staked herself alone, with a surveyor's rod and a stubbornness that bordered on holy, now sat in legal limbo, waiting for someone to claim it properly. Under the laws, as they stood on the frontier, a married woman's property transferred automatically to her husband. An unmarried daughter, under coverture, held almost nothing in her own name. Marin knew all of this. She'd spent 14 months reading everything she could get her hands on, including a dog-eared copy of statutes covering the Married Women's Property Act that she'd found tucked inside her mother's cedar chest, hidden under a false bottom, along with a ledger, 2 letters, and a deed of claim written in Cora's careful hand. She knew exactly what Bat Creed wanted. It wasn't her. It was what marrying her would let him own. Opening bid, her father called out, and his voice cracked just slightly on the second word. She noticed. She wondered if anyone else did. Who'll start at 300? Bat Creed raised 2 fingers from where he sat at his usual corner table, unhurried as a man ordering supper. 300. The room went quiet in a specific way, the kind of quiet that meant nobody else was going to say a word. Creed's enforcers were distributed through the crowd the way bad news was distributed evenly. And everywhere you looked, 300, her father repeated. And she could hear the relief in it, the desperate, ugly relief of a man about to have his problem solved. Do I hear 350? 350 for a fine healthy. You can bid on my skin. Marin hadn't planned to say it. It came out before she'd decided. Rising up from somewhere below reason, from the same place anger lives when it's been compressed long enough that it stops being just emotion and becomes something harder, something load-bearing. She looked at the room for the first time, but my dignity ain't on the ledger. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This one had weight. Some of the men in the back shifted their boots against the floorboards. A few looked at the ground. One older man near the window took off his hat and held it against his chest, and she didn't know why, but that one small gesture nearly broke her. Batcreed was watching her with something close to appreciation. That was almost worse. Spirit, he said. Good, I prefer it. He flicked his fingers again. 300 stands. Let's close this, Malachi. Her father raised the gavel, an actual gavel. She had no idea where he'd gotten a gavel. It was somehow the most absurd detail in an absurd and terrible evening, and opened his mouth to bring it down. The leather pouch hit the bar counter like a small thunderclap. Everyone in the room heard it. The sound was distinct, the solid, dense thud of something heavy and metal, landing with purpose, not tossed, placed, set down by someone who knew exactly the weight of what he was putting on the table. Marin turned her head. She hadn't noticed the man come in. That alone should have told her something. In a room this crowded and this loud 40 men, shoulder to shoulder, she had been tracking movement and counting exits and watching the doors. And she had not noticed him come in. He was standing at the bar with one boot on the footrail, his duster hanging open, tall, dark-haired under a low-brimmed hat. Lean in the way that suggested he didn't waste anything, not movement, not words, not space. He had a holster on his right hip with a Colt Peacemaker that she could see had been well used and better maintained, and at his left hip, the handle of a Bowie knife. He had one hand resting on the leather pouch. He looked at the barkeep first. What's the tally? The barkeep, a wide man named Pell who Marin had spoken to exactly once in her life and found surprisingly decent, looked at the pouch, then at Creed's table, then back at the man. 300, mister. How much is in there? 600. The man nodded. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at Creed. He looked at the barkeep and said, simply, then the debt is settled, and the difference covers any objection. Bat Creed's chair scraped back from the table. Not fast. Creed didn't do things fast. He stood slowly, buttoning his jacket at the waist, and looked across the room at the man by the bar. That's federal coin, Creed said. He wasn't asking. He had eyes for that kind of thing. It is, the man said. And who are you to come into my county and throw federal coin on my transaction? The man finally turned his head and looked at Creed directly. The look on his face wasn't angry. It wasn't challenging. It was completely, thoroughly calm. And somehow that was more unsettling than either of the other options would have been. A man who's going to walk out of here with a lady, he said. Unless you'd prefer to make tonight considerably more complicated than it needs to be. The room did not breathe. Marin watched Creed's enforcers. She counted 3 that she could see shifting their weight, hands moving toward coats and belts. She counted the distance between the man at the bar and the nearest one. She calculated, out of lifelong habit, what the next 60 seconds were likely to look like. Creed studied the man at the bar for a long moment. Then he looked at the leather pouch. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled. "You've bought yourself a considerable problem, friend," Creed said pleasantly. "I look forward to collecting on it." He sat back down, picked up his glass, and looked away as if the whole matter had already ceased to interest him. Which meant, Marin understood immediately, that it was far from over. It just meant he'd decided to finish it somewhere other than here, and on terms he liked better. Her father was still holding the gavel. He looked between Creed and the man at the bar, and she watched him do what he always did. When confronted with two bad options, he chose the one that let him off the hook faster. He set the gavel down on the barrel without bringing it down, and he stepped back, and he did not look at her. She had stopped expecting him to. The man at the bar walked toward her. The crowd moved out of his way without him asking. He stopped at the barrel, and he reached into his duster, and she tensed every muscle in her body, coiled against what came next, because she had been tensed for most of the last hour, and her body no longer knew how to stop. He pulled out the Bowie knife. She did not flinch. She was proud of that afterward. Her hands were bound in front of her, and the knife was coming toward them, and she held perfectly still and looked him in the face. He had dark eyes, steady as anything she'd ever looked at. He slid the blade beneath the hemp rope, at her wrists just the flat of it first, creating space, making sure. And then he drew it upward in one clean stroke, and the rope fell away in two pieces. She felt the blood rush back into her hands. The relief of it was almost painful. He stepped back. He gave her room. He put the knife back at his hip, and then he looked at her the same way he'd looked at Creed, with that same complete, unhurried calm. And he waited. She rubbed her wrists. She looked at the pieces of rope on the floor. She looked at the room full of men, half of them watching her, and half of them carefully looking elsewhere. And she looked at her father, who was studying the floorboards like they contained something worth reading. She looked back at the man who had just put $600 federal on a bar counter for reasons she did not yet understand. "Where to, ma'am?" he said. Just that. No explanation. No expectation on his face. No particular lean to the question, not toward the door, not toward the stairs, not toward anything. He asked it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like the answer was entirely hers to give, like he had all the time there was and would wait for however long she needed. She thought about the rope on the floor. She thought about her mother's deed, folded small and tucked into the inside pocket of her traveling coat, which she had sewn shut with 3 stitches so it wouldn't fall out. She thought about the calendar on the far wall. July 1876. A mountain range nobody had bothered to visit. She climbed down from the barrel. Her legs were steadier than she expected. She straightened her coat, and she looked the man in the face, and she said, "Away from here." He nodded once. He turned and walked toward the front door. She followed. The crowd parted the same way it had for him, without being asked, without theater, simply moving out of the way. She did not look back at her father. She had been calculating the cost of that choice for most of her 20 years. She had been extending credit on hope, telling herself he might yet become something worth staying for. She had run the numbers enough times to know they didn't balance. A debt that never shrinks is not a debt. It's a trap with a name on it. She had stopped waiting on Malachi O'Shea. The front door swung open, and the Nevada night hit her face, cool, vast, smelling of sage and dust, and nothing like the inside of that room. The sky above the scrubland was an improbable depth of black, stars dense enough that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental, almost an afterthought. She stopped on the saloon's front step and breathed it in. The man was already at the hitching post, untying the reins of an Appaloosa stallion, a big animal, spotted dark and white across the haunches, who turned his head and regarded her with mild interest. "You got a horse?" the man asked, not looking up from the reins. "No." He finished untying and turned to look at her. "Can you ride?" "Yes." He took the reins in his left hand and held them out toward her, not offering to help her mount, not positioning himself to boost her up or give her instruction. just holding out the reins. She looked at them for a moment. Then she took them. She put her boot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle in one motion, settling herself, feeling the horse shift his weight underneath her, and then steady. She gathered the reins properly and looked down at the man. He was watching her with his hands loose at his sides. "You're not going to tell me where we're going," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "You told me where," he said. "Away from here, I know." "A path." "And what do you want for the $600? He was quiet for a moment. The horse is his, or the one she was sitting on, she wasn't sure yet, breathed softly in the dark. "Nothing you haven't already got the right to keep," he said. She held his gaze. She was good at reading people. Her mother had taught her that too, along with ledgers and land law and the careful arithmetic of survival. She searched his face for the angle, for the thing underneath the words that would tell her what this was really about, what the transaction actually was, what she was actually agreeing to. She found calm. She found patience. She found something that might have been weariness, the deep-boned kind that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. She didn't find what she was afraid she'd find. That didn't mean it wasn't there. She knew better than to take a man's face as final evidence of his character, but it was enough to keep moving. "There'll be men behind us," she said. "I know, Creed doesn't let things go. I know that too. And you still threw $600 on a bar counter." He looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted, not into a smile exactly, but toward one. "Had to be done," he said. Quiet, simple, like it was just that obvious. She looked at him a moment longer. Then she clicked her tongue against her teeth, and the Appaloosa moved forward, and the man fell into step on foot beside her until they were clear of the hitching post. And then he swung up onto another horse she hadn't even clocked was tied further down a dark bay, ground-tied and waiting, and came up alongside her. And they rode out of Oakhaven together into the sage-scented dark. She kept her free hand near the inside of her coat. The shiv she'd made from a hairpin and a piece of flattened tin was in her sleeve, within reach. She'd put it there that morning before Malachi had come in with his plan fully formed and his voice already in salesman mode, and she wasn't going to pretend she'd stopped needing it just because the situation had changed. She glanced at the man riding beside her. He sat a horse the way men did when they'd spent serious time on them, relaxed but balanced, easy in the saddle without being careless. His hat was pulled low against the night wind. "You have a name?" she asked. "Jed," he said. "Jedediah Thorne." She turned it over. "People call you Jed. Most. Some call you something else." A pause, some. She waited to see if he'd say what. He didn't. "Marin O'Shea," she said. "I know, that landed oddly." She looked at him again. "You knew my name before tonight." "Yes." She calculated what that meant and what it didn't mean, and set it aside for now, because the road ahead was dropping into low scrubland, and the stars were the only light, and she needed to pay attention to the ground. Behind them, Oakhaven's lights faded to a faint smear on the dark horizon. She did not look back. She thought about the calendar, July 1876. She thought about her mother's hand on the surveyor's rod, pressing it into Nevada ground, claiming something, choosing something. She thought about the deed folded and sewn into her pocket, 3 stitches of dark thread, waiting. She thought about the word her father had used. Fine young woman. Capable. Healthy. Strong stock. Like she was livestock. Like the only question worth answering about a human being was what she was worth to someone else. She thought about what she'd said in that room, rising up out of her before she'd decided to say it. And she thought about the men who'd looked at the ground and the one who'd taken his hat off. "You can bid on my skin, but my dignity ain't on the ledger." She hadn't planned it, but she meant it. She meant every syllable of it, down to the bone. The Appaloosa's hooves found the packed dirt track heading northwest, and she settled her weight into the saddle, and the Nevada night opened up enormous around her, and somewhere ahead of them was a path she didn't know yet, leading somewhere she hadn't been yet, with a man she didn't understand yet, who had put $600 on a bar counter and asked her a single question and then let the answer be entirely hers. She didn't trust him. Not yet. She wasn't built for fast trust, and the frontier hadn't taught her to grow it any faster. But she was out. She was on a horse with reins in her hands. The rope was on the floor back in Oakhaven, and her wrists still burned where it had been. And she was going to carry that burn for a few days yet, and she was glad for it, because she intended to remember. She rode. The stars multiplied overhead as they got further from town. Jed rode beside her without talking, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. He didn't try to fill the silence, didn't explain himself or reassure her, or make promises she'd have no way of testing. He just rode, present and watchful and quiet. Behind them, far back now, she thought she heard the sound of horses leaving Oakhaven in a hurry. She shifted her hand toward her sleeve, breathed. Jed heard it too. She could tell by the way his shoulders settled slightly. Not tense, but alert, the way a man gets when something he expected has finally arrived. "How far to shelter?" she asked. "Half a night's ride," he said. "Into the hills. And these men behind us? I'll handle them." "You'll handle 40 men?" "Not 40, he said. "Creed wouldn't send more than 6 at this hour. Loose ground and no moon." He glanced at her briefly. "He'll send better ones tomorrow," she absorbed this. "You're not frightened?" "I'm careful," he said. "It's not the same thing." She thought about that. As the sound of distant hoofbeats behind them grew incrementally louder and the sage scrub blurred dark on either side, and the Nevada desert spread itself wide and indifferent all around them. Careful, she thought. Not fearless. Careful. Maybe that was the distinction worth holding on to. She squared her shoulders, tightened her grip on the reins, and rode northwest into the black. The desert, at midnight, was a different country than the desert at noon. Marin had lived in Nevada her whole life, and she still wasn't ready for it when it came that cold, the kind that dropped off the mountains like something falling, like the temperature had been waiting all day for the sun to turn its back before it moved in properly. She hadn't brought a coat heavy enough. She'd had about 4 minutes to grab what she could before Malachi had come in with his plan and his gavel and his salesman voice, and a heavy coat had not made the cut. She didn't say anything about it. She wasn't going to. She rode. Jed rode. The Appaloosa beneath her was sure-footed on the loose track, picking his way through scrub and shadow without much guidance, which told her. This was a horse that had done a lot of night riding. She kept the reins light in her hands and let him work. Behind them, the hoofbeats were closer. She'd been tracking them by ear since they left town, the sound moving in and out of range depending on the terrain, swelling when the ground was flat and dropping away when the track dipped into a dry wash. She counted what she could. 4, she thought. Maybe 5. Creed had said 6. Was the number Jed expected. "They're gaining," she said. "I know. We're not going to outrun them on this ground." "Not trying to," Jed said. He pulled his bay to a stop at the edge of a low ridge. Below them, the track dropped into a wide stretch of brush sage and scrub oak, thick enough to swallow a man whole if he moved carefully. Jed swung down from his saddle, quiet as water, and tied his reins to a twisted branch without looking at what his hands were doing. He unslung the Winchester from the saddle scabbard. "Keep riding northwest," he said.
Same pace.
"Don't stop." Marin looked down at him. "You're going to stay back. I'll catch up." Against 6 men. He looked up at her then. The starlight was thin but enough to see by. "I'm not planning to fight 6 men," he said. "I'm planning to take 6 men's horses out from under them. It's different." She held his gaze. "You could kill them, I could," he said. "But they're hired hands doing a job. Batcreed's the problem. Not these boys," he said it simply, like it was a practical observation rather than a moral one, which she supposed it also was. Dead men don't give testimony. Dead men don't name their employers in a federal court. She filed that away. Federal. She touched her heels to the Appaloosa's sides, and moved forward, northwest, same pace as before, and she did not look back. She counted her own heartbeats. She measured distance by how far the sound of her horse's hooves seemed to travel. She listened for the men behind her, and then she listened for Jed, and after about 2 minutes of riding through the scrub, she heard the first rifle shot, a single, flat crack, not close, carried on the holder from the ridge behind her. Then a second, then a third and fourth, in quick succession. And after that, she heard what she'd been half expecting, the sound of horses breaking off the track, screaming and stumbling into brush, riders shouting. Not the sounds of men being shot. The sounds of horses going lame in the dark, brought down by something precise and deliberately non-lethal, crippled at the legs so they'd stop but not die. The riders going down into the sage, unhurt but grounded. No pursuit. She kept riding. Jed caught up to her 11 minutes later. She knew because she counted. He came up on her left at a lope, settled his bay back to a walk alongside the Appaloosa, and reslung the Winchester in the scabbard. He didn't say anything about it. Neither did she. They rode in silence for a while. She was thinking about his hands, the way he'd cut the rope at her wrists, the blade going in flat, careful, making space before cutting, and the way he'd unslung that rifle, and now the way he held his reins, loose and easy. She'd spent 20 years around men whose hands told you things before their mouths did, and his hands said practiced restraint more clearly than anything she'd heard him say out loud. She was still cold. She pulled her coat tighter across her chest with one hand and kept the reins in the other and set her jaw against the shivering. She would not shiver visibly. She had already made that decision. Something rustled in the brush to her right, and the Appaloosa flicked his ears, but didn't spook, and she gave him a quiet sound of approval through her teeth. Jed reached behind his saddle and untied something from the back. He held it out toward her without comment. A heavy canvas duster rolled tight, the kind that blocked wind and cold, both. She looked at it, looked at him. He was still looking forward, not at her, the coat just extended in his right hand, waiting. She took it. She shook it out one-handed and swung it around her shoulders without stopping her horse and got her arms into it. And the warmth was immediate and almost embarrassing in its relief, because her body had been hoarding what heat it had for the last hour. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, eyes on the track. She pulled the duster closed and kept her left hand near her sleeve out of habit. The shiv was still there. She hadn't decided yet whether to move it somewhere more accessible or leave it where it was. She left it. The track climbed gradually after that, moving out of the flat scrubland and up toward the first foothills. The ground changed underfoot, harder, stonier, the Appaloosa's hooves ringing differently. The sage gave way to sparse juniper. The cold got worse before it got better, cutting in off the mountain faces to the northwest. Marin shifted in the saddle. The inside of her thighs were burning. She wasn't unaccustomed to riding, but she'd been tense since before they left Oakhaven. Every muscle braced and tense riding over rough ground. For an hour, did specific damage to specific places. She didn't say anything about that either. Around what she estimated was 2 in the morning, Jed stopped them in a hollow between 2 rock faces, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides, with a clear line of sight back down the trail. He swung down from his horse first and started untacking the bay. Marin stayed on the Appaloosa for a moment. She looked at the hollow. She looked at the 2 rock faces and the one open side and the trail below. She calculated the geometry of it: 2 people, 1 shelter, darkness, and she felt the cold knot of wariness pull tighter in her chest. And she hated that it was there. Hated that the arithmetic of trust had brought her to this, because she was tired, and her wrists still hurt, and she would very much have liked to just sleep, without first calculating whether it was safe to. But she had learned long ago that what she would very much have liked and what was actually wise were frequently different things, and that confusing them was a luxury she could not afford. She dismounted. slowly, letting her legs take her weight carefully because they were unhappy about it. She held herself steady and didn't make a sound. She untacked the Appaloosa the way she'd been doing it since she was 9 years old, efficiently and quietly. And she rubbed him down with the saddle blanket and staked him on a long line where the juniper grew thin enough for grazing. Jed had already done the same with his bay and was laying out his bedroll on the far side of the hollow. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He unrolled it, smoothed it flat, and sat down on the near edge to pull off his boots. Then he looked up at the sky for a moment, reading something there, clouds or stars or wind, and then he stood back up, picked up the bedroll, and moved it. Set it down again, approximately 10 paces from where it had been. 10 paces closer to the open side of the hollow, further from where she was standing. He lay down on top of it, boots set aside, hat settled over his face. He turned onto his side, facing away from her. He didn't say a word about it. No announcement, no explanation, no look to see if she'd noticed. She stood very still in the cold. She had noticed. She spread her own bedroll on the sheltered side of the hollow, near the rock face that blocked the northwest wind. And she lay down, with the canvas duster still wrapped around her and her back against the stone, and her eyes open. She listened. The desert made its own sounds at this hour, the distant bark of a coyote, the sigh of wind across stone, the soft shifting of the horses on their lines. She tracked each sound and identified it and let it go. She kept her hand near her sleeve. Jed's breathing slowed and deepened within about 10 minutes. She tracked that too. He slept the same way he rode without wasted effort. No tossing, no noise. Back turned as promised, 10 paces between them, honoring an unspoken agreement she hadn't even had to make. She stayed awake for another hour at least, watching the open side of the hollow, listening down the trail for any sound of pursuit. Nothing came. After a while, the cold settled into something bearable, and the exhaustion she'd been holding off since morning began to press at the edges of her mind. She let herself close her eyes for a moment. Just a moment. She woke to early gray light and the sound of Jed at the hollow's edge, crouched down, studying the trail below. He'd been up before her. His bedroll was already rolled and tied. His boots were on. She sat up. Her back ached where the rock had been. Her legs were stiff. Her wrists were bruised purple-yellow at the rope line, and she was hungry. Jed turned when he heard her move. "No riders last night," he said. "We've got maybe 3 hours before Creed sends better men." She got up. She rolled her bedroll without rushing and tied it neat and carried it to the Appaloosa. She tacked him up in silence. After a few minutes, she said, "The 600 you put on the bar." Jed was checking his bay's left foreleg, running his hand down the cannon bone. He didn't look up. "What about it? Where'd it come from?" A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to lie more. The pause of someone deciding how much truth was enough. "Compensation," he said, "for work done." "Whose work?" "Mine." She buckled the last strap on the Appaloosa's girth and turned to face him. "You said federal coin?" Creed said it. "Actually. And you didn't argue with him?" Jed stood up from the bay's leg and looked at her directly. "No. So you work for the federal government?" "Sometimes." She waited. "Right now," he said, "I work for getting you clear of Bat Creed long enough to put something permanent between him and you." He paused. "The legal kind of permanent." She turned that over. "The legal kind, not the other kind." He'd specified. "And the 600, she said. Every dollar of it was mine to spend." He said it flat and plain, not defensive, not looking for credit. "What I do with my own money isn't the government's business." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without fidgeting. She gathered her reins and put her boot in the stirrup and mounted up. "All right," she said. He mounted the bay. "All right. I'm not saying I trust you," she said. "I'm saying I'm willing to keep moving in the same direction for now." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. She thought it might have been respect, actually. The particular kind that comes when someone refuses to pretend they feel something they don't. That's more than fair. he said. They moved out of the hollow as the sun broke the eastern ridge in a long blade of pale gold, and the Nevada scrubland lit up around them in all its cold, indifferent beauty. And Marin pulled the canvas duster tighter and rode northwest with her wrists bruised and her back aching and her hand near her sleeve. She thought about what he'd said in the hollow, the legal kind of permanent. She knew the laws. She'd read them, memorized the key passages, annotated them in the margins of her mother's hidden ledger in her smallest handwriting. She knew what Bat Creed was after, and she knew which statutes he was using, and she knew which statutes could cut right back against him if someone knew where to find the edge. The question was whether Jedediah Thorne, whoever he actually was, whatever he actually worked for, was someone she could use that knowledge with, someone who would hear it as intelligence, rather than dismiss it as a woman reading too many books. She didn't know yet, but she was watching. The foothills rose around them as the morning came in. The junipers thickened, and the air smelled of pine resin and snowmelt, even though there was no snow yet this far down, just the promise of it on the high peaks ahead. The Appaloosa stepped easy on the new ground. Marin counted things out of habit. Mile, hours, resources. She had a small roll of bills in her coat's interior pocket, wrapped in oilcloth. She had the deed, sewn in. She had the shiv in her sleeve, which she probably wouldn't need today, but which she was keeping anyway. She had her mother's voice in her head, calm and precise, the way it always was when Cora was teaching something she wanted to stick. The law is a weapon, same as any other, Marin. The difference is, you can carry it inside your head, where no one can take it. She had that. She also had about 9 ounces of dried jerky in her saddlebag, which she'd grabbed on the way out of the house, and which she pulled out now and ate methodically, chewing slowly, because dried jerky required it, watching the trail ahead. After a moment, she reached across the distance between their horses and held a strip out toward Jed. He looked at it. "Eat something," she said. "You bled last night." He hadn't, actually, that she'd seen, but she'd noticed him moving his right shoulder carefully when he mounted up, and she'd seen the way he favored it on the rocky descent from the ridge, and she was not going to pretend she hadn't. He took the jerky, without commenting on what she'd implied. "Thank you," he said. "We're going to need both of us functional," she said. "Practical. Clear. Not charity." He chewed. "Watch the trail." Agreed. The morning opened up around them. The mountains got closer and bigger, their granite faces catching the young light and throwing it back copper and white. Somewhere ahead, Jed had said, was a way station. Shelter. A woman named Hester who ran the place alone. Marin was looking forward to another woman. She had not realized, until this particular moment on a mountain track in the early light, how much she had been existing in a world run entirely on men's terms. Her father's terms. Creed's terms. The terms of every man in that saloon who had stood there watching and done nothing. Jed had done something. She gave him that, but she was looking forward very much to a woman's face. She settled her weight into the saddle and let the Appaloosa find his pace, and let the mountain air work on her cold, still sharp at the edges, but clean in a way the Oak Haven saloon had not been in a very long time. She kept her hand near her sleeve. She kept her eyes open. She rode. They smelled the wood smoke before they saw the cabin. It came down off the mountain in a thin curl, carrying pine and something else underneath it, something cooked, something with fat in it, something that made Marin's stomach pull hard toward it before her brain had even finished identifying what it was. She hadn't eaten anything since the jerky. That had been hours ago. The track had climbed steadily since mid-morning, switchbacking up through pine forest and granite shelves. The horses working hard on the loose shale sections, their breath coming in short white puffs in the cold mountain air. The sky above the peaks had gone the particular flat gray that meant weather was thinking about arriving. Not today, maybe, but soon. Jed had said very little since morning. She had said very little back. They had developed a functional silence between them that was not uncomfortable. so much as watchful. Two people on a trail they both understood was not safe. Measuring things, conserving energy. She had stopped checking her sleeve every 5 minutes around midday. She wasn't sure when exactly it happened. She'd noticed it at some point, noticed that her left hand was just resting on her thigh rather than hovering near the inside of her wrist. And she'd made a conscious decision not to move it back. Not because she trusted him completely, because the vigilance was expensive, and she needed to save some for whatever came next. The cabin materialized out of the trees gradually, the way things did at elevation. First, just a darkness between trunks that was too regular to be natural. Then the shape of a roofline, then the yellow warmth of a window, small and square, against the granite cliff face behind it. It was a solid structure. She noticed that first. Not thrown up quick the way a lot of frontier buildings were, gaps in the logs and hope in the chinking. This one had been built to stay. The logs were fitted close, and the chinking was fresh maintained, and the roof had proper weight to it. Shingled rather than sodded, with a stone chimney working steadily. There was a lean-to stable attached to the left side, and a woodpile stacked head-high along the right wall, and a kitchen garden in front, put to bed for winter, but clearly tended the raised beds, edged with flat stones, the soil turned over and dark. Someone lived here who intended to keep living here. Jed raised a hand in front of her. A signal slow down. Wait, he whistled. Two short notes, a pause, one long, a beat of silence. Then, from inside the cabin, muffled through the log walls, two short notes came back. All right, he said, and rode forward. The door opened before they reached the hitching rail. The woman who came out was maybe 55, maybe older. It was hard to say, because the mountain had weathered her in ways that were interesting rather than diminishing, carving her face into sharp lines and deep-set eyes that took in Marin and Jed and their horses, and the trail behind them all in one practiced sweep. She was tall, not as tall as Jed but close, with wide shoulders and heavy-soled boots, and a dark wool coat that had seen better decades. Her gray-streaked hair was pinned up simply, and there was a rifle leaning against the doorframe 2 inches from her right hand. She looked at Marin first, then at Jed, then at Marin's wrists, the bruised lines still visible above her cuffs. Come in, she said. That was all. Inside was warm in a way that felt like a physical thing, like walking into something solid. The cabin was one large room with a sleeping loft above, a stone hearth taking up most of the north wall, a long table, shelves of provisions stacked methodical and dense, and the smell was the stew she'd caught on the trail, coming from a heavy iron pot hanging over the fire on a crane arm. Marin stopped just inside the door and stood there for a moment, just letting the warmth come at her from all sides. The woman Hester, she assumed, had already moved to the hearth and was pulling the pot forward on its crane. She lifted the lid, checked it, set the lid aside. Sit, she said, gesturing at the long bench beside the table. Both of you. Marin sat. Jed sat across from her, setting his hat on the table, running a hand back through his dark hair. He looked more tired than he had on the trail, which was something he'd been suppressing, she realized. The contained stillness he carried, that careful economy of movement, it had been work. She was seeing what was underneath it. Hester ladled stew into two deep bowls, cut 2 pieces of dark bread from a loaf on the shelf, and set both in front of them without ceremony. Then she went to a small cabinet, came back with a jar of something and a folded cloth, and set those on the table beside Marin. Marin looked at them, looked at Hester. Your wrists, Hester said. Eat first if you want, but do the wrists before you sleep. Marin looked down at her hands. In the firelight, the bruising was worse than she'd thought, deep purple-blue at the pressure points, the skin abraded in a band all the way around. She'd been ignoring it well enough on the trail, but Hester's calm attention to it made ignoring it feel suddenly childish. Thank you, Marin said. Hester nodded once and pulled a chair to the fire and sat down herself. The stew was extraordinary. That was the only word for it. Venison, and root vegetables, and something herbed that she couldn't name. The broth rich and dark, the bread dense enough to hold a full scoop of it. Marin ate the way she'd eaten the jerky methodically, not rushing, but this was harder to be methodical about, because every mouthful was actively good, and she hadn't had a hot meal since before yesterday, and her body was registering its appreciation loudly. Jed ate across from her with the same focused attention he gave everything. Hester sat by the fire and watched the door. After a while, Marin opened the jar Hester had left an herbal salve, something with calendula in it by the smell, and something sharper underneath, maybe yarrow, and worked it carefully into the abraded skin at her wrists. It stung for a moment, and then eased. "Rope?" Hester asked, without looking over. "Hemp," Marin said. Hester made a sound that conveyed a complete opinion on the subject without using any words. "You're Hester Buchanan," Marin said. "I am. Jed mentioned you. I'd imagine." Hester glanced at Jed. "You look like you've been running since last night," he said. "Creed?" "Yes." Hester absorbed this without visible reaction, the way someone does when they've been expecting news and it's arrived more or less on schedule. She got up, went to the window at the side of the cabin, and looked out at the trail for a long moment. Then she came back and sat down. "You've got some time," she said. "Not a lot. This pass is the only clean route northwest in early winter, and he knows it same as everyone." She looked at Jed. "You planning to shelter here or move on at first light?" "First light," he said. Hester nodded, stood up, and went to the hearth again. She refilled Marin's bowl without asking, which Marin appreciated, because she would have said no out of politeness, and she was still hungry. Marin watched Hester move around the cabin. Watched the efficiency of it, nothing wasted, everything in its place, every motion direct and purposeful. This was a woman who had been running this station alone, long enough that the work had become its own language, fluent and unconscious. "How long have you been here?" Marin asked. Hester considered the question as she hung the pot back. 11 years. "Alone?" "My husband passed in the second winter." She said it without softness, not because the grief was gone, but because it was old enough to carry straight. "I stayed. Most people wouldn't have. Most people had somewhere else to go." Hester sat back down. She looked at Marin with those sharp, deep-set eyes. "Do you?" Marin held the question for a moment. "I'm working on it," she said. Hester smiled at that. Not a large smile, just the real kind. The fire crackled and the wind came up outside against the cabin walls, and the horses shifted in the lean-to stable, and the stew pot ticked as it cooled. It was as quiet and warm a room as Marin had been in for a long time. She was unwrapping the cloth Hester had left and wrapping it loosely around her left wrist when Jed spoke. "My sister's name was Clara." Marin went still. He was looking at the fire. Not at Hester, not at her. His forearms were resting on the table, and his hands were clasped, and he was looking at the fire the way a person looks at something they're saying out loud for the first time. "She was 16 when they took her." He paused. "I was 20, working a ranch up in the territory. By the time I got word, she'd already been 2 months in a labor syndicate camp up near the copper mines. Washoe County." Another pause. "Not the same as what happened to you last night, but close enough in structure." The fire popped. Marin set down the cloth and did not pick it up again. "I got there," he said, "but not in time to matter. Not in time for it to make any difference to Clara." He stopped, breathed once. "She made it out. She's alive. She lives up in Sacramento now. Has a small dress shop. Does well enough." He said the last part like he needed to establish it, needed it on record. "But she shouldn't have needed to survive it in the first place. And I was her brother, and I wasn't there." Hester was watching him with the particular stillness of someone who has heard pieces of this before and knows when not to speak. Marin looked at his hands, clasped on the table, still and steady, the same hands that had cut rope off her wrists 12 hours ago. "That's why you're here," she said, "in Washoe County. Working on Creed." He looked at her then. "Partly." He was quiet a moment. "I told myself it was the work. The commission. The case. He looked back at the fire. But when I saw you on that barrel last night, it wasn't the commission I was thinking about. Marin didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Some things don't get better with words put on them. After a while, Hester stood up. She went to the loft ladder and pulled a folded blanket down from the second rung where it was stored. She brought it to Marin and set it beside her on the bench. "There's a pallet up in the loft," she said. "You take that. Jed knows where the stable blankets are." Marin looked at Hester. Hester looked back, and in her face was something Marin recognized, the clear, quiet expression of a woman who has had to make her own rules about her own space and has long since stopped apologizing for it. "Thank you," Marin said. Hester put a hand briefly on her shoulder. One firm, warm press. Then she moved away to bank the fire for the night. Marin sat for another minute. The warmth of the room worked at her like a slow tide. The ache in her legs was settling into something duller, more distant. The wrists still burned under the salve, but it was a healing burn, purposeful, moving in the right direction. She thought about Clara Thorne in a dress shop in Sacramento, 16 years old and put to work in a copper mine labor camp. She thought about the way Jed had said. She made it out the particular emphasis on it, the insistence, like he needed the good ending to be clearly on record before he allowed himself to sit with the rest of it. She thought about her mother pressing a surveyor's rod into Nevada ground, claiming something, refusing to have it taken. She thought about herself on that barrel, looking at the far wall and what had come up out of her when she finally looked at the room. Instead, "You can bid on my skin, but my dignity ain't on the ledger." She'd meant it. She still meant it. But she was beginning to understand that meaning something was just the beginning, meaning it had to be backed by something. Her mother had backed it with a land claim and a ledger full of statutes and a deed hidden under a false bottom. Hester Buchanan had backed it with 11 years on a mountain pass alone, maintaining a relay station that the territory needed whether it was grateful for her or not. And Jedediah Thorne had backed his with $600 on a bar counter and a rifle fired with enough precision to cripple horses without killing riders. There were different currencies for it. The point was having one. She climbed the loft ladder slowly, her legs registering each rung with specific commentary. The pallet up top was narrow but well padded, covered in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of cedar and pine smoke. She pulled the canvas duster over herself on top of the blanket and lay in the dark, looking at the rough-hewn raft above her. Below, she heard Hester move to the door, speak to Jed in a low voice, and then the door opened briefly on a current of cold air before closing again. Jed going to the stable. Hester banked the fire. The light below went amber, then low, then the quiet, breathing dark of a properly settled cabin. Marin listened to the wind off the mountain. She thought about the look on Jed's face when he'd talked about Clara. Not broken by it, he'd had years to carry the shape of it, but not armored against it either. He'd let her see it, and she understood that wasn't something he did easily or often. She understood it the same way she understood a line in a ledger, not because someone explained it to her, but because she could read. She had been afraid of him on that horse. She had been right to start that way. She was still watchful. She was still keeping her own counsel and her own calculations. But she was also lying in the dark with Hester's good stew still warm in her and the mountain wind outside, and Jed Thorne sleeping in a stable, because that was how he chose to spend a cold night in November, adjusting her numbers. Not throwing them out, adjusting them. That was the honest thing to do with new information. Her mother's voice again, patient and precise. "A ledger only works if you're willing to enter what's actually there, not just what you went in expecting to find." She turned onto her side. She pulled the duster closer. She slept. In the morning, Hester was already at the fire when Marin came down, working something in a cast-iron pan that smelled like cornmeal and rendered fat. She handed Marin a cup of coffee without being asked, the mug heavy and hot, and Marin held it in both hands and stood near the hearth. "He told you about his sister," Hester said. Not a question. Yes? Hester turned the cornbread in the pan. He doesn't do that. She said it matter-of-factly. Points. Just noting a fact for the record. Marin drank her coffee. I've known Jed Thorne for 4 years, Hester said. He's come through this pass maybe a dozen times. He's never told a soul about that girl while sitting at my table. She paused. He's told me once. 2 years ago, middle of a bad winter, after too much whiskey and a case that had gone wrong. She flipped the cornbread. He told you sober, over a bowl of stew. Marin didn't say anything. I'm not telling you what to do with that, Hester said. I'm just telling you what's there. The door opened, and Jed came in from the stable stamping snow from his boots. It had come overnight, after all. Light, just a dusting on the high ground. And he stopped when he saw them both standing at the hearth, and his expression went briefly unguarded before it settled back into its usual quiet. Snow on the pass? Hester asked. Light, he said. Passable. Eat something before you go. He came to the table. Hester served the cornbread. They ate, the three of them, in a silence that was easy rather than empty, the fire working and the morning light coming pale through the small window. When they were done, Marin helped Hester clear the table. Not because she'd been asked, because the cabin was Hester's, and the meal had been Hester's, and there was a correct way to leave a place that had been generous to you. Hester pressed a cloth parcel into her hands at the door. More food, wrapped tight for the trail. Marin took it and met Hester's eyes. How did you do it? Marin asked. 11 years. Alone. Hester looked at her for a moment. Then she said, I decided that the land was mine and I was going to act like it. Every single day. Even when I didn't feel like it. She paused, especially then. Marin nodded slowly. You'll find your version of that, Hester said. You've already started. She stepped back inside. The door closed quietly. Marin stood on the step a moment in the cold, the cloth parcel in her hands, the snow-dusted mountain spread out before her, and the trail going northwest, and the Sacramento Valley somewhere beyond the peaks, far off but real. Jed brought the horses around from the lean-to, tacked and ready. He held the Appaloosa's reins out to her. She took them. She mounted. The cold hit her face, and she pulled the canvas duster close and looked down the trail that climbed the pass, white-dusted and narrow, and going somewhere she hadn't been yet. She was not afraid of it. She was watchful. She was calculating. She was carrying her mother's deed, and 3 stitches of dark thread, and a shiv in her sleeve, and Hester Buchanan's voice in her head, and a new set of adjusted numbers. She was also, somewhere under all of that, curious about what came next. That was new. She registered it carefully and filed it. Ready? Jed asked. Yes, she said. They rode up into the pass as the morning sun came over the eastern ridge and lit the snow gold and pink, and the mountains received them without comment, and the trail ahead was long and cold and entirely open. Silver Peak smelled like money and desperation in roughly equal measure. That was Marin's first impression as they rode in off the mountain track, the smelter smoke hanging flat over the rooftops, the sound of stamp mills running somewhere beyond the main street, the particular quality of noise a boomtown made when it was still deciding whether it was going to last. Loud, eager, slightly frantic underneath. The town had gone up fast. She could tell by the way the buildings sat, some of them solid brick or dressed stone, built by men who'd decided to stay. Others still raw lumber, the boards green and warping already, built by men who weren't sure yet. The main street ran 3 blocks long with a bank at one end and a smelting office at the other. And everything in between was the usual arrangement of commerce and appetite. General store, assay office, 2 saloons, a land office with a hand-painted sign that someone had misspelled and then corrected badly. People moved on the boardwalks with that specific boomtown energy, quick and purposeful, everybody angling toward something. A man in a good coat came out of the bank counting bills. A mule team blocked the intersection ahead. A woman in a gray dress picked her way around a mud puddle without slowing down. Marin watched all of it and kept her face quiet. They'd come in separately, which had been Jed's idea, and which she'd agreed was the sensible one. He'd laid it out that morning on the trail, straight and plain. Creed had riders in Silver Peak, almost certainly. Two people coming in together on horseback after a hard ride off the mountain pass would draw a specific kind of attention. Two separate arrivals, an hour apart, were just two more people in a boomtown. So, she'd come in first. He'd told her where to go: the land office, the municipal records room attached to it, and the name of the clerk who was honest, which Jed said narrowed it down to one person in the building. She found the records room without asking for directions. Third door off the main corridor, behind the land office proper, where a small placard said Municipal Archives, public access upon request. The clerk was a young man named Aldous, 20 at most, with ink on his fingers, and the slight look of someone who had chosen clerical work specifically because it kept him away from physical danger. He showed her the records cabinet without hesitation and went back to his desk without hovering, which she appreciated. She spread what she needed across the reading table and got to work. Her mother had taught her to read a ledger the same way you read a landscape, not just the features that advertised themselves, but the ones that were trying not to be noticed. A missing entry was information. A number that rounded too cleanly was information. A date that didn't quite match what it should was information. She applied that same reading to the municipal land transfer records for Washoe County. Starting from 14 months ago, working forward, she found the first problem within 20 minutes. It was a deed transfer filed under the name Whitfield O'Shea, which was her mother's claim. The filing date was 6 weeks after Cora O'Shea had died. That by itself might have been clerical delay. She'd seen that before. Estates took time, but the transfer wasn't to the estate. It wasn't to Marin, who was the surviving heir. It transferred a 5/8 interest in the silver vein to a holding company called Meridian Basin Trust. She did not recognize that name. She wrote it down carefully in the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. Then she went back further, looking for Meridian Basin Trust in any other filing. She found it 3 more times, twice in mining claim transfers from the previous year, once in a water rights agreement from 18 months back. Each time, the original owner had been bought out or transferred under circumstances that looked, at a glance, like normal commercial transactions. At a glance, she pulled the water rights agreement and read it carefully. The seller's signature was witnessed by a notary named Clement Voss. She wrote that down too. Then she pulled one of the mining claim transfers. Same notary, Clement Voss. She pulled the deed transfer on her mother's claim. Same notary, Clement Voss, signing off on a transfer that shouldn't have been legally possible, because a deceased woman's estate couldn't transfer property without a probate proceeding, and there was no probate filing in this records room for Cora O'Shea. She sat back from the table. Someone had skipped the probate step, either through ignorance, which she doubted, or through deliberate intent, which she did not doubt at all. The transfer had been filed as if Cora O'Shea had signed it herself, 6 weeks after she was already in the ground. That was forgery. That was a specific crime with specific statutes attached to it, and she knew most of them by heart. She was still sitting there with the forged transfer in front of her when the door to the records room opened, and Jed came in. He looked at her face first, then at the documents spread across the table. He crossed the room and stood beside her, looking down at what she'd laid out, and she watched him read it the way she'd read it methodically, without rushing. Meridian Basin Trust, he said. You know it? I know it's Creed's, he said. I've been trying to prove it for 8 months. He looked at the Clement Voss signature. Voss is the county notary. He's also the mayor's brother-in-law. The mayor, she said,
Yes.
Theodore Marsh. He's Creed's man. Has been since before Creed moved into the county. He paused. I didn't have a document trail. I had testimony from people who were too scared to put their names on paper. Marin set the forged transfer down flat on the table and pointed to the date. 6 weeks after my mother died. No probate filing anywhere in this building. She couldn't have signed this herself. No. So whoever filed this either forged her signature directly or backdated a document she signed before she died, which would require proving she signed it under duress or without understanding what it was. Either way, Jed said, it's fraud. It's more than that. She pulled the water rights agreement over and set it beside the transfer. Same notary, same trust, same pattern. Original owner transfers rights under circumstances that should have required oversight and didn't get it. She looked up at him. How many times has Creed done this? Jed was quiet for a moment. As many as he needed to, he said. She looked back at the documents. The Married Women's Property Act, she said. Nevada adopted it in 1873. Under its provisions, property held in a woman's name before marriage remains hers. My mother staked that claim as Cora Whitfield before she married my father. It was in her name alone. I know the act. Then you know that even under coverture, a husband couldn't transfer property that was solely in his wife's name without her direct signature and consent before a witness. She set her hand flat on the forged transfer. Malachi's name isn't on this. Creed didn't even bother going through my father. He bypassed him entirely, which means he knew this claim was solely my mother's, and he filed a fraudulent transfer anyway. Jed looked at her steadily. That's a federal fraud charge. It's also evidence that invalidates everything. Creed claims to hold through Meridian Basin Trust, she said. If this document is forged, and if the same notary certified all the other transfers, then every one of them is potentially compromised. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the stamp mills kept their rhythm, distant and mechanical. Not caring. Jed pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at the documents, and then he looked at her, and she read his expression correctly. He was taking it seriously. Not translating it, not simplifying it, not looking for the version he could explain to someone else later. He was sitting with it the way you sit with information that matters. The notary, she said. Voss. Where is he? City Hall. 2 blocks north. And the mayor. Same building, different floor. Is Voss the kind of man who filed fraudulent documents because he was paid to, or because he was threatened to? Jed thought about it. Paid, he said. Voss likes comfort. He's not brave enough to need threatening. Then he's the weaker point. You're thinking about testimony. I'm thinking about the difference between a document trail that proves fraud and a document trail, plus a living witness who will testify to how it happened. She looked at him. A federal commissioner can compel testimony. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of some kind. Like a man who has been looking at a problem from one direction and finds that someone else has already walked around it. I'm going to need copies of these, she said. She had already been thinking about how the clerk Aldous, his ink, a careful hand. She could do it herself in an hour. She wrote clearly and fast, a skill her mother had drilled into her from childhood, because a ledger entry made in a hurry was a ledger entry that caused problems later. The clerk, she said. Aldous, you said he was honest. Honest enough, Jed said, and smart enough to know which way the wind is blowing with Creed. Will he certify copies as true reproductions of the originals? If I ask him, then ask him. She was already reordering the documents, arranging them in the sequence that would make the argument clearest: the forged transfer first, then the water rights agreement, then the other 2 mining transfers, then a page from the deed index she'd found that showed all 4 transactions certified by the same hand. She looked up and found Jed watching her. She held the look. What? Nothing, he said. That's not a nothing expression. He was quiet a moment. I've been in Washoe County 8 months, he said. I've had 3 federal investigators and a territorial marshal looking at Creed's operations. None of them found that in a land office. She looked at the documents on the table. They were probably looking for the crime, she said. I was looking for my mother's name. She said it plainly, not with any particular weight on it, just the plain truth of the thing. And it was true. She had come into this room looking for what had been taken, not for an abstract pattern of fraud. The fraud was there because she'd followed something personal into a room and read carefully once she arrived. Her mother's handwriting was nowhere in these files. That was the first thing she'd checked, instinctively, before she'd checked anything else. Cora O'Shea had a distinctive hand, small, slanted sharply left, the capital letters larger than necessary, in a way that had always seemed to Maren like emphasis, like her mother, underlining herself without meaning to. There was no hand like that on the transfer document. The signature over Cora O'Shea's name was blocky and upright, and had been made by someone who'd never seen the original. She hadn't said that to Jed yet. She'd set it aside because it wasn't the legally useful information a federal case needed, documents and testimony, not a daughter's certainty about her mother's penmanship, but she'd sat with it for a moment alone before she'd moved on. I'll get Aldous, Jed said, and got up. He was back in 4 minutes with the clerk in tow. Aldous looked at the documents on the table, and at Maren, and then at Jed, and something moved through his expression that was not quite fear, and not quite relief, but a complicated combination of both. I need certified copies, Maren said. 4 documents. I'll copy the text. You certify them as true reproductions of the originals currently held in this office. Aldous looked at the forged transfer. He looked at it for a long moment. Clement Voss notarized that, he said. Yes, he's the county notary. He is, she said. And he certified a property transfer 6 weeks after the named transferor was already deceased, with no corresponding probate filing in this office. She kept her voice even, matter of fact, giving him the information the way her mother had always given difficult information directly, without softening, on the theory that a person who understood a hard thing clearly was better equipped than a person who'd been cushioned into confusion. Aldous was quiet for a moment. He looked at Jed. This goes to federal court, Jed said. Your name is on the copies as certifying clerk. Your name is not on the originals. He let that sit for a moment. There's a difference. Aldous absorbed this. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his own pen. Give me the documents in the order you want copied, he said. I'll certify each one as I go. Maren divided the work neatly, she wrote, Aldous observed, and compared against the original. And when she was done with each page, he signed and stamped the copy with the office seal. They worked through all 4 documents in just under an hour. Aldous was precise about it, checking each copy against the original twice before signing, which Maren found reassuring. When it was done, she rolled the copies together and wrapped them in the oilcloth she kept in her saddlebag. Aldous gathered up the originals and returned them to the filing cabinet in the sequence he'd found them, which told her he'd been trained correctly for record-keeping, whatever else he was. He closed the cabinet drawer. The Meridian Basin Trust, she said to him. Have you had other filings from them? Ones I might have missed? He hesitated. I'm not asking you to produce them right now, she said. I'm asking if they exist. A longer hesitation. Then, there are 3 filings in the 1,875 index that I'd have to pull separately. They came in before I started here. He paused. The previous clerk left suddenly. I was told he took another position. Maren looked at Jed. I'll follow up on the previous clerk, Jed said. Aldous nodded once and went back to his desk and picked up his pen and began very deliberately working on something that had nothing to do with any of them, which was his way of indicating that he was done talking and had also possibly said more than he'd intended. Maren tucked the oilcloth parcel inside her coat. She and Jed went back out through the land office into the pale afternoon light. The main street was busier now, midday foot traffic filling the boardwalks. She adjusted the collar of the canvas duster she'd kept it on. It was cold enough to justify, and it changed her silhouette which mattered, and walked beside Jed toward the far end of the block without looking like she was going anywhere in particular. "The previous clerk," she said quietly. "I'll find out," he said. "Tonight. The 3 additional filings." Yes. She was turning it over in her head, the shape of what they had. The certified copies in her coat were evidence of a specific act of fraud committed against a specific piece of property, her mother's claim. That was the personal dimension. Creed had done this elsewhere, to other people, through the same mechanism, which meant the federal case was potentially much larger than one silver claim. She thought about the water rights agreement. Whoever had held that before Meridian Basin Trust filed its claim, they'd lost something. A right to water in the Nevada desert wasn't a small thing. In a dry year, it was the difference between a working ranch and nothing. She thought about the mining claim transfers. "How many people has he done this to?" she asked. Jed was quiet for a step or two. "In this county over the past 3 years, we think at least a dozen documented properties. Probably more that were settled quietly." He paused. "Creed doesn't like disputes. When he moves on someone's property, he usually moves fast enough that by the time the person understands what happened, they're already out. But my mother's claim wasn't settled quietly. No, because you had the deed and you knew what it said." He glanced at her briefly. He didn't account for that. She hadn't thought of it in exactly those terms before. Her mother had hidden that deed carefully, the false bottom, the sewn pocket, the care taken to make sure Marin found it and understood it. Cora O'Shea had known, at the end, that something was coming. She'd been preparing her daughter for a fight she wasn't going to be there to run herself. Marin kept walking. "The Overland tickets," she said. "You said you were going to get them. Stage leaves tomorrow morning," he said. 7 o'clock? Is that enough time? For what? She thought about the 3 unfiled documents Aldous had mentioned. She thought about Clement Voss, 2 blocks north in City Hall. She thought about a living witness who could testify to how the fraud was committed, which was different from a document that showed it had been. She also thought about Creed's men, who were somewhere in this town. She'd been tracking the street since they arrived, and she had 3 candidates' men who were standing in ways that were slightly too still, positioned in places that had good sight lines to the main street, but weren't doing anything that required them to be there. "Enough time depends on what we do tonight," she said. Jed followed her sight line to the men she was watching. He didn't make it obvious. "Which one concerns you most?" "The one by the assay office," she said. "He's been there since we arrived, and he hasn't gone inside." "That's one of Creed's," Jed confirmed. "The other 2 I make as hired, not his regulars, so he knows we're here. He knew we'd come through Silver Peak. We didn't have another option." She absorbed this. The geometry of the situation was shifting. They had what they needed, or most of it. But the window was closing. Creed would know they'd been in the land office. He'd know eventually that documents had been copied. The question was how much time they had before he moved to close the record another way. "We need to move tomorrow morning," she said. 7 o'clock. Then tonight we copy whatever Aldous finds in the 1875 index, and we stay separate, and we stay quiet." She paused. "And we don't go near City Hall." Jed looked at her. Voss can testify, but not from here and not today." She thought about the testimony, questioned carefully. A frightened man with something to hide might recant, might disappear, might become suddenly and conveniently unavailable if Creed learned what they had before they were clear of his county. A federal subpoena from Sacramento was harder to avoid than a local one. He'll be more useful as a witness after we're out of Washoe County. Jed was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've thought about how this goes to court." "I've thought about it since my mother died," she said. "I just didn't have the documents yet." He nodded slowly. Not performing agreement. Just agreeing, taking the information in, and placing it where it belonged. That was what she'd been watching for, since the beginning of this. Not whether he thought she was capable. She didn't need his assessment of her capability. She was watching for whether he would actually use what she brought, treat it as what it was, rather than as something to be translated or managed or explained to someone else. He'd listened to the Meridian Basin Trust and gone straight to the federal fraud charge. He'd heard the Married Women's Property Act and not explained it back to her. He'd sat across that table in the records room with his elbows on the wood and his eyes on the documents, and he'd said quietly that 8 months and 3 investigators and a territorial marshal hadn't found what she'd found in under an hour. She hadn't said it was because they were looking for the crime, and she was looking for her mother's name in order to prove something to him. She'd said it because it was true, and because she thought he could hear it. He had. She looked at the boomtown street around her, the stamp mills and the mud, and the 2 saloons, and the men standing in wrong places watching for her. She looked at the oilcloth parcel inside her coat, the certified copies, the evidence that a dead woman's property had been taken by fraud, and that the mechanisms of that fraud were documented and reproducible in court. She thought about her mother pressing a surveyor's rod into Nevada ground. I claimed this. This is real. 7 o'clock, Marin said. I'll have the tickets, Jed said. They separated at the next corner. She went right, toward the boarding house Jed had named that morning as the safer of the 2 options in Silver Peak, run by a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who asked no unnecessary questions. He went left, back toward the land office, to speak to Aldous about the 1,875 index. She walked the 3 blocks to the boarding house at a steady pace. The man by the assay office didn't follow her. She checked twice without making it obvious. Inside her coat, her hand rested on the oilcloth parcel. Her mother's claim was in there, documented and certified. 6 weeks of fraud and 14 months of uncertainty, and she'd found it in less than an hour because she knew how to read a ledger, and she knew her mother's name, and she had refused from the beginning to let those 2 things be separated. She stepped up onto the boarding house porch. The mountains stood at the end of every street in Silver Peak, massive and patient, the snow line moving lower on their faces as the afternoon cooled. The Sierra Nevada didn't care about Bat Creed or Meridian Basin Trust or any of the machinery of small men trying to take what wasn't theirs. The mountains were just there, same as they'd been before, same as they'd be long after. Marin went inside. The stage left Silver Peak at 7 o'clock exactly. Marin was already in her seat when Jed swung up and settled across from her. 2 tickets in his coat pocket and a canvas bag stowed in the boot outside. He didn't say good morning. She didn't either. They'd spoken the night before, briefly when he'd come to the boarding house with the 3 additional copies from Aldis's 1,875, index 2 more Meridian Basin Trust filings, both showing Clement Voss's notary stamp, both missing proper probate documentation. She'd added them to the oilcloth parcel, and they'd agreed on the morning plan, and that had been that. The other passengers were a mining engineer with a drafting case across his knees and a Quaker woman traveling alone who had settled herself into the far corner and begun reading immediately. Nobody spoke. The stage rolled out of Silver Peak as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, throwing long shadows down the main street. Marin watched the town fall away through the window, the smelter smoke and the stamp mill noise. And the 2 men who'd been stationed at the street corners, both gone now, which was the detail that stayed with her. Men who'd been watching and had stopped watching were usually men who'd gotten the information they needed and reported it. She looked at Jed. He was already looking at her. He gave a slight nod. He'd seen it too. They had maybe a 4-hour head start if Creed's men had ridden out last night. Less if they'd used a relay. The stage road northwest ran through the first range of foothills and then dropped into a long valley before climbing again toward the Sierra Nevada proper. Marin knew the general geography. She'd studied the route on a territory survey map she'd found in Mrs. Pruitt's parlor the night before, tracing it with her finger in the lamplight. The valley section was open and fast. The mountain section was not. There was a pass called Devil's Gorge, about 3 hours out. The road went through it because there was no practical way around it, sheer granite on both sides. A half-mile of narrow canyon where 2 wagons could barely pass, and then it opened again on the far side into the broader mountain valley that eventually became the Sacramento Corridor. She'd noted it on the map. She'd thought about it. She'd said nothing to Jed, because there was nothing useful to say about an unavoidable choke point, except to be aware of it. She was aware of it. The mining engineer fell asleep before the first hour was out. The Quaker woman turned pages at even intervals. Outside, the valley opened wide and pale under the November sky, sagebrush running flat in every direction. The mountains ahead, massive and sharp-edged. Around mid-morning, the wind picked up. Not a clean wind. This one had grit in it. Coming off the dry lake beds to the south, carrying fine alkaline dust that whitened everything it touched. The driver up top called down that they were getting weather, and Marin could see it through the window, a brown-gray curtain moving across the valley floor from the southwest, advancing with the particular deliberateness of a desert dust storm, working itself up to full commitment. The Quaker woman closed her book. The mining engineer woke up. By the time they reached the mouth of Devil's Gorge, the storm had caught them. It came in fast at the end, the way they always did, first just haze and grit, then the light going brown and strange, then full horizontal dust moving hard enough that Marin could hear it against the stage walls like thrown sand. The driver slowed the team. He had to. You couldn't run horses blind. Inside the gorge, it was worse. The canyon walls channeled the wind into something meaner and louder, a sustained roar that pressed against the stage from both sides. The light was the color of old brass. Marin could see perhaps 30 feet through the window before the dust swallowed everything. She'd moved her left hand to the inside of her coat near the oilcloth parcel. Jed had moved forward in his seat, not standing, just present in a different way. Weight shifted, attention sharpened. His right hand was resting near his holster without being on it. The mining engineer said something about the weather. Nobody answered him. The shot came from the right canyon wall. She heard it a fraction of a second. Before the stage lurched the flat crack of a rifle swallowed almost immediately by the storm noise, but not quite. And the near side-led horse screamed and went down, and the stage slewed, hard left, the wooden frame groaning, and the mining engineer slid into the Quaker woman and Marin, grabbed the door frame and held. The driver was shouting. More shots, she couldn't count them in the noise. And the chaos. Sound coming from everywhere at once. The storm and the horses and the crack of rifles. Echoing. Off granite down, Jed said. And he wasn't asking. She was already dropping below window level. The Quaker woman had done the same without being told, pressing herself flat against the floor with a calmness that suggested she'd survived difficult things before. Jed pulled his Colt. Through the window above her head, Marin could see shapes moving in the brown dust riders, at least 4 of them, coming off the canyon walls on switchback tracks she hadn't been able to see in the storm. They'd been waiting, positioned on both sides, above the road, invisible in the dust, until the stage was fully committed to the gorge with nowhere to go back or forward. This was planned, not opportunistic. Creed hadn't sent riders after them. He'd sent riders ahead of them. The stage had stopped. The surviving horses were tangled and panicking. The driver, she couldn't see him, and that worried her, had gone quiet up top. One of the riders came alongside the right window. She saw him through the gap, dark coat, hat pulled low against the dust, rifle across his saddle. He wasn't one of the men from last night. Different build, different horse. Better ones, Jed had said. He'll send better ones tomorrow. It was tomorrow. The door handle moved. Jed put himself between the door and Marin. in the time it took her to register the handle moving. And when the door swung open, he had the Colt level, and the man on the other side stopped. "Easy," the man said. He had his hands up, showing them not a fighting gesture, a talking gesture, which meant he had instructions beyond just shooting out, he said. "Both of you. Nobody gets hurt." Behind him in the dust, she could see two more riders, holding positions. She couldn't see the fourth. Jed didn't move immediately. He was doing what she was doing, counting, calculating, reading the geometry of the situation. Two visible guns on their side, at least two more on the left. The mining engineer had pressed himself into the corner and was as white as chalk. The Quaker woman was still on the floor, face down, praying quietly. "What does Creed want?" Jed said. "The woman," the man said. And whatever she took out of the land office, he was looking past Jed at Marin when he said it. "Creed's not asking for trouble with the federal government, mister. He just wants his property. Returned his property." She held on to that word and what it cost her, and kept still. "Step out," man said again. "Both of you." Different directions, slowly. Jed glanced at her. One quick look, carrying something specific in it, not a plan exactly, but an acknowledgement. He was going to step out. He was going to put himself in the open. And whatever happened after that, the oilcloth parcel in her coat needed to stay in her coat. She read all of that in one look. She gave him a short nod. He stepped down from the stage, hands visible but not raised. The Colt still in his right hand at his side. She followed, left hand pressed flat against the inside of her coat. Outside the storm was something else entirely. The dust was thick enough to taste alkaline and dry, coating the back of her throat immediately. She squinted against it. The gorge walls rose on both sides, granite faces, disappearing into brown haze above. The road here was maybe 20 feet wide. She counted 4 riders now, 2 close on the right, 1 on the left, 1 further back covering the rear. The man, who'd opened the door, dismounted. He was taller on the ground than he'd looked on horseback, with the build of someone who'd spent serious time doing physical work. He held his rifle loosely, barrel angled down, which was the professional way to hold it ready without being theatrical. "The bag," he said to Marin, inside the coat. "There's no bag," she said. "Creed says different. Creed isn't here." The man's expression didn't change. He took a step toward her. Jed moved a fraction. Just his shoulders, just his weight. A small shift that said something very clear without saying anything at all. The man stopped. He looked at Jed. "I've got 4 guns on you," he said. "I know," Jed said. "And you'd like to take the woman and the documents back to Creed without killing a federal commissioner. Because that's a different conversation than the one you're already in." He said it the same way. He said most things straight, without drama, just information placed on the table for the other man to work with. A pause, long enough that the wind filled it. "Federal commissioner," the man said. "Special appointment. Territorial court." Jed's voice was even. "You're currently pointing rifles at a federal officer in the commission of his duties. That's one charge. Interfering with federal evidence is another. And if anything happens to the woman, those charges get considerably heavier." He let that sit for a moment. "Bat Creed isn't going to be in any position to protect you from federal prosecution. You might want to think about that." She was watching the men. All 4 of them. The 2 close on the right had shifted slightly, not retreating, but uncertain. They were hired, like Jed had said about the ones from the first night. Men doing a job. Men who'd agreed to stop a stage and take papers from a woman, not to draw down on a federal commissioner. The calculation changed when the terms changed. The lead man hadn't lowered his rifle, but he hadn't raised it either. He was doing arithmetic of his own. Then everything happened at once. The 4th rider, the one covering the rear, the one she'd been least able to track in the dust, fired. Not at Jed, not at her. She never knew exactly what he was firing at, whether he'd seen something in the storm or spooked or simply decided. The shot went wide, cracking off the canyon wall to the left, and the echo in the gorge was enormous. doubled and redoubled off the granite. Jed moved. She'd seen him move fast before, the night at the ridge with the Winchester. This was different. This was close quarters and no warning, and everything happening in the same 2 seconds, and he went right. Because the rider on the left was the immediate threat, and he was firing as he moved. One shot, precise. And the left rider's horse screamed and lurched sideways into the gorge wall, rider going down hard into the dust. The lead man swung his rifle up. Marin threw herself left, behind the stage wheel, and as she did, she heard the shot close, the closest gun sound she'd ever heard in her life. The concussive force of it, something physical rather than just auditory, and something hit the stage door above her with a splintering crack. She pressed her back against the wheel and held the oilcloth parcel through her coat and breathed. More shots, she counted them without seeing them. The dust made it impossible to track by sight. Everything reduced to shapes and sound. She heard horses, the panicked sound of animals in a fight, and the crack of Jed's Colt, measured, deliberate, nothing wasted. Then silence except for the storm. She stayed behind the wheel. 30 seconds. She counted. Marin. Jed's voice from her left. She looked around the wheel. He was standing in the road, approximately 15 feet away. His left arm was hanging wrong. She came out from behind the wheel and crossed to him. He was standing upright, and he wasn't going down, but his left shoulder was soaked through his duster, dark and spreading fast, and his left arm was held slightly away from his body, in the way a person held a limb that had stopped taking instructions. "The riders?" she said. "2 down," he said. 2 ran. He said it with effort. The controlled stillness he usually carried was costing him more right now. She got her hand under his right elbow, not the hurt side, and looked at the shoulder. The bullet had gone, through the upper left, high enough to miss the lung, she thought. She was not a doctor. She was working from her mother, having treated enough ranch injuries to have taught her the basics, and from the fact that he was standing and breathing without the particular wet sound that meant something catastrophic. He was still holding the Colt in his right hand. "You can holster that," she said. He looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. He holstered it. She needed cloth. She needed pressure. She started on her own coat first. The oilcloth parcel first, transferred to her inside vest pocket, secured, and then she stripped off the canvas duster and was already folding it when Jed said quietly, "Don't waste that." "It's my coat," she said. "Hold still." She pressed the folded canvas against the wound and put his right hand over it, and said, "Hold that hard." He did. The stage driver was alive. She found him a minute later, sitting against the front wheel, with a gash across his forehead from what had apparently been a fall when the lead horse went down, not a bullet wound. Shaken. Coherent enough to tell her one of the other passengers had already gone for the horses. The mining engineer, it turned out, was more useful in a crisis than his chalk-white face had suggested. He had the surviving horses unentangled and the dead one cut loose in the time it took Marin to get back to Jed. Jed had not moved from where she'd left him. She checked the canvas, soaked through, already on the facing side, but holding. She added her vest, folded double on top of it. "We can't stay in this gorge," he said. "I know that. There's a farm on the far side of the pass, about 2 miles. The driver will know it. Can you ride?" He looked at the horses the engineer had freed, looked back at her. Yes, it wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it, but it was true enough for 2 miles, and that was what they had. She helped him mount. She didn't make ceremony of it, just put her shoulder under his right side and steadied him through the swing up, and he got there, and she checked that he had the reins before she let go. Then he looked down from the saddle. She was about to go for her own horse when she saw his expression. The storm was thinning slightly, still dust-thick, but the worst of it moving east, and the light in the gorge had shifted from brown brass to something grayer, and in that light she could see his face clearly. He reached into his duster with his right hand, awkward, left hand pressed to his shoulder and pulled something out, a folded document. She recognized the federal court seal from 3 feet away. Her stomach went cold. He held it out to her. "You should see this." She took it, unfolded it. It was a warrant. Federal Territorial Court, Wasco County. Investing authority, property fraud, unlawful coercion. She read the charges fast, and then she read the subject line. And she stopped. Her name was on it, not as a witness, not as a complainant. Her name and a description and a sketch rough, but recognizable. Maren O'Shea. The warrant authorized investigation of property connected to the estate of one Cora O'Shea. Deceased. She read it again. Read the authorization date. Read the issuing judge's name. Then she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned. The riders who'd run hadn't gone far. 2 of them, coming back through the thinning dust, and one of them had a rifle up, and the other one had something in his hand that he held out ahead of him like a flag. It was a copy of the warrant, Creed's copy. The rider pulled his horse up 20 feet from her. He looked at the document in her hand and then at Jed above her, and then back at Maren. "Creed says, to tell you," the rider said, loud enough to carry over the wind, "that your gunfighter there wasn't buying your freedom. He was securing federal evidence. Everything he did, from the saloon to this road, it was a sting." He nodded at the warrant in her hand. "That document authorized him to locate you specifically and acquire the O'Shea property claim for federal custody." He let it land. Then he turned his horse and rode back into the dust. And the second rider went with him, and the gorge went quiet except for the wind. Maren stood in the road. She looked at the warrant, at her name on it, at the federal court seal, at the authorization for Jedediah Thorne, Special Commissioner, to investigate and acquire. She looked up at Jed. He was watching her from the saddle. His face was pale from blood loss, and the canvas was soaking through, and he opened his mouth like he was going to say something. She folded the warrant. She looked at him for one long moment, and she did not say a word. There was nothing to say. Not here, not now, not with 2 miles to cover and a wound that needed proper attention and Creed's men somewhere in the thinning storm. She turned away from him. She found her horse. She mounted. She tucked the warrant inside her coat, alongside the oilcloth parcel, all of it together. Every document, evidence, and accusation folded against the same chest. And she clicked her tongue and the horse moved. She didn't look back. She rode through Devil's Gorge and out the far side into the cold gray afternoon. And the mountains stood enormous on every side, and the wind carried the last of the dust east across the valley. And she held herself very straight in the saddle and kept her eyes on the road ahead and did not let herself feel. Yet, whatever it was she was going to feel about this, there would be time for that later. Right now, there were 2 miles between her and shelter, and a man bleeding behind her who might be a liar or might not be, and a set of documents in her coat that were either evidence of justice or evidence of a transaction, and she had no way to know yet which one was true. She rode. The farm appeared out of the gray, exactly where Jed had said it would. The silver shaft smelled like old water and rust, and 30 years of dead air. Maren had been in mine shafts before her mother had taken her out to the claim, once, when she was 12, just to see it, just so Maren would know what the land looked like from the inside. That shaft had been dry and clean timbered, smelling of pine resin and fresh-turned earth. This one was none of those things. This one had been abandoned long enough that the timber supports had gone gray and soft, and the water that seeped through the granite walls had left long iron-red stains down the rock face, and the air sat still and cold and tasted of minerals. She'd had approximately 4 seconds to take all of this in when Creed's men had pushed her through the entrance. That was 2 hours ago, maybe 3. It was hard to track time in the dark. They'd taken her at the farm. She'd known it. The moment she rode into the yard, the wrong number of horses at the rail, the farmhand standing in the wrong place, the door to the barn open when it should have been closed against the cold. She'd registered all 3 things in the same breath, and she'd already been turning her horse when 2 of Creed's men came out of the barn and 2 more came around the side of the house, and there was nowhere to go that didn't involve riding directly into a rifle. Jed had been behind her, barely too far behind to matter. She'd heard him shout once as they took her horse's reins. Then she'd heard a shot, and she'd twisted in the saddle and seen him go down into the dry wash beside the road, his bay veering hard right as he fell. And then Creed's men had her arms, and she couldn't see anything past the horses closing in around her. She didn't know if he was alive. She was putting that thought in a specific place in her mind and leaving it there. She couldn't afford it right now. She would afford it later when she had room for it. But right now she needed everything she had for what was in front of her. What was in front of her was an iron cuff on her right wrist, bolted to a ring driven into the shaft wall, and 3 feet of chain between them. Her left wrist was free. They'd checked her coat, taken the canvas duster entirely, but they'd missed the interior vest pocket, which was where she'd moved the oilcloth parcel in the gorge. They'd also missed the shiv in her sleeve. She'd held completely still when they searched her. Breathed shallow. Kept her left arm slightly bent, so the sleeve hung naturally over the hairpin and tin construction she'd been carrying since the morning Malachi had come in with his plan. She had spent 20 years learning which stillness was invisible and which stillness drew attention, and she used that knowledge now, and it worked. So she had the documents, and she had the shiv. What she also had, as of about 30 minutes ago, was her father. Malachi O'Shea sat against the opposite wall of the shaft, wrists bound in front of him with rope, not iron, just rope, which told her something about how much Creed valued him as a threat, and he had not looked at her directly since they'd shoved him in. She'd looked at him. She'd looked at him carefully and taken a complete inventory. He was thinner than she remembered. His coat was dirty, and his boots were worn through at the left sole. He had a bruise along his jaw that was 2 or 3 days old, gone greenish-yellow at the edges. He smelled of whiskey and something underneath it that was older and more tired than whiskey. He looked like a man who had been making bad choices for so long that the choices had started making him. She waited to feel something large about it, something that matched the size of what he'd done. Instead, she just felt tired, and that was almost worse, because tired meant she'd already spent most of what she had on this particular grief, and what was left wasn't grief at all. It was just recognition, clear-eyed and cold as the shaft air. The entrance to the shaft was maybe 40 feet behind her, around a slight curve in the tunnel. She could see a thin slice of daylight when she turned her head, and 2 silhouettes Creed's men stationed outside. She'd been listening to them for the past hour. She could hear when they moved, when they spoke to each other, when one of them walked the perimeter. She'd been running her free hand along the chain for the past 20 minutes. The ring in the wall was driven deep. That wasn't the weak point. The cuff itself was old iron, not steel, with a locking mechanism that had been exposed to enough moisture in this shaft that she could see the rust blooming around the keyhole. Rust degraded the internal pin structure. If the pins had corroded enough, the mechanism could be manipulated without a key. She needed something thin and rigid. The shiv was too thick. The hairpin component of it might work, but she'd have to separate it from the tin backing, and she'd have to do it quietly, and she'd have to do it before Creed came in, which she estimated she had somewhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours to accomplish, based on the message one of his men had carried in an hour ago. She got to work, the tin backing separated from the hairpin with 3 careful bends, each one done slowly. The metal flexed rather than snapped so it didn't make noise. The hairpin was 4 inches long and stiff enough to hold its shape. She turned it against the heel of her palm and felt the tip. Good enough. She found the keyhole by touch and began working. Her mother had taught her to pick a lock the same way she'd taught her everything practical, without drama, and without apology. Cora O'Shea had grown up poor enough that understanding mechanisms was a survival skill, not a party trick. She'd shown Marin the basic principle once, with a padlock from the barn, and Marin had practiced it on every old lock she could find for about 2 months afterward, because she was the sort of person who, when shown how something worked, needed to work it until she understood it from the inside. The pins in the cuff were corroded, but present. She could feel 2 of them. The third was either seized or gone entirely. She worked the first pin up, held it with lateral pressure, moved to the second. Behind her, Malachi shifted against the wall. "Marin?" he said, low, almost a whisper. "Quiet," she said. Same volume, a pause. Then, "Are you working?" she said. "Be quiet." He went quiet. She got the second pin, held both with lateral pressure, and felt the cylinder shift just slightly, just the beginning of movement. The third pin was seized. She worked around it, applying tension, feeling for the point where the cylinder would turn far enough with only 2 of 3 pins set. Old locks, corroded enough, sometimes gave you that. This one did. The cuff opened with a sound like a small cough, metallic and brief, and her wrist was free. She held still for 10 seconds, listening to the entrance. The guards hadn't moved. She brought her right wrist close and looked at it in the thin light. Red and stiff where the iron had been, but nothing serious. She flexed her fingers. They worked. She stood up slowly, keeping her back against the wall, and she looked at her father. Malachi was watching her. His eyes in the dim light were red-rimmed, and she couldn't tell if it was dust or something else, and she didn't spend time trying to determine which. She crossed to him, silent on the shaft floor, and she crouched in front of him and looked at his bound wrists. Simple rope. 2 half hitches and a square knot, tied by someone who knew what they were doing. She worked the knot by feel, patient, and it came loose in about 90 seconds. Malachi rubbed his wrists. He looked at the open cuff on the floor. He looked at her. "How did you?" "My mother taught me," she said. He flinched, just slightly. She noticed and didn't soften it. She was moving back toward the wall to retrieve the tin piece and reassemble what she could of the shiv when Creed walked in. He came around the curve of the tunnel with a lantern in one hand and 2 men behind him, and he stopped when he saw Marin standing free in the middle of the shaft with the open cuff on the floor at her feet. He looked at the cuff for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Resourceful," he said. He sounded genuinely appreciative, which was the most unsettling version of Bat Creed available. He set the lantern on a rock shelf and crossed his arms. "I'll make a note." He was dressed well. He always was, she'd noticed. Good coat, good boots. The studied presentation of a man who understood that in a territory where most men looked like they'd been dragged through the landscape, looking expensive was its own kind of power. He had a Colt on his hip, and one of his men had a rifle, and the other was just large, which was its own argument. She stood where she was. Creed looked at Malachi, then back at Marin. "I'm going to make this simple," he said. "Your father owes me $300 plus 18 months of accumulated interest on a series of smaller debts he's been running since before your mother died. The total, as of this morning, is $460. He said the number plainly, like a man reading from a ledger. "I'm willing to zero that balance entirely." Marin waited. "In exchange," Creed said, "you sign a marital transfer document that gives me legal access to the Whitfield O'Shea silver claim through a proper marriage contract. We handle the paperwork tonight. Register it in the morning." He unfolded a document from his inside coat pocket and held it out so she could see it from across the shaft. "Your father walks out of here. The debt disappears. And you get a husband with enough money that you'll never spend a night in a mine shaft again." She looked at the document. She looked at Creed. "And if I don't sign it," she said. Creed looked at Malachi for a moment. The look was precise and unhurried and communicated a complete range of possibilities without requiring him to say any of them out loud. Malachi made a sound. She didn't look at him. "I want to be clear about something," she said. She kept her voice even, and she looked at Creed directly, the same way she'd looked at the room in Oakhaven 2 nights ago. "You already filed a fraudulent transfer on my mother's claim?" I have certified copies of that document, and 3 others like it, all notarized by Clement Voss, all missing proper probate filings. A very brief stillness came over Creed's expression. Those copies, she said, are in the hands of a federal officer. That was not entirely true, but it was true enough. Jed had known about the documents before he'd gone down. Whether he was alive to act on that knowledge was a question she was holding in the place she'd put it. Anything you file tonight gets added to an existing federal fraud case. Marrying me doesn't clean that document trail. It just gives the court one more exhibit. Creed was quiet for a moment. Then, he said, the federal officer you're referring to is currently at the bottom of a dry wash with a bullet in his shoulder. She held herself, still. He's alive, Creed said. I told my men alive. He's more useful that way. He paused. Now she breathed once, slow. The documents, she said, were copied and witnessed by a clerk at the Silver Peak Municipal Archives. His name is in the certification. She hadn't told Creed about Aldous, and she was doing it now deliberately, putting the name on the table, because a man who operated through forged documents and leveraged debts understood leverage. She was showing him that the documents existed beyond her. That taking her out of the equation didn't solve his problem. Creed studied her. He was doing arithmetic. She could see it. You're a 20-year-old woman, he said, almost conversationally, in a mine shaft, with no horse, no weapon, and no one who knows you're here. My mother was a woman alone in Nevada with a surveyor's rod and a land claim, she said. You spent 18 months trying to take what she built, and you had to forge her signature to do it because she never gave you an opening. She looked at him steadily. I'm her daughter. The shaft was quiet, except for the sound of water moving somewhere deep in the rock. Creed looked at Malachi again, this time longer. The message in the look was specific and ugly, and Malachi understood it clearly enough that he pressed back against the wall. Sign the document, Creed said to Marin, or we have a different conversation about your father. And here was the thing she'd been carrying since she was old enough to understand what her father was. The exact shape of this moment, this precise transaction, where someone used Malachi O'Shea as leverage against her because they'd correctly identified that she was the one with the capacity for loyalty. She turned and looked at her father. He was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a clean word for. Not asking. He wasn't asking her to save him. He knew better than that, maybe, or he was too tired for it. He was just looking at her the way a man looks at something he's broken and can't fix. She looked back at him for a long moment, and then she said what needed saying, because she had carried it long enough, and because silence had never made it smaller. You murdered her spirit, she said, long before her body gave out. Malachi closed his eyes. Not with your hands, she said, with your cowardice. Every debt you ran. Every morning you chose the bottle and the table over the ranch. Every time she stood between you and the consequences and paid the price for it herself. She kept her voice level. She built that claim alone. She hid that deed alone. She taught me everything I'd need to fight for it, because she knew by the end that she was fighting it alone. She stopped you were her husband, and you were nowhere. The shaft held the words. Malachi didn't open his eyes. I'm not signing anything, she said to Creed. She turned back to face him. Not to save him. Not to save myself. And not because I'm being brave, because your document is fraudulent on its face, and adding my signature to a fraudulent contract doesn't make it valid. It just makes me a party to the fraud. She pulled out the oilcloth parcel from her vest pocket and held it up so Creed could see it. I have the evidence that proves the original transfer was forged. A signed marriage contract on top of that is just more paper for the federal case. Creed looked at the parcel. Something moved through his expression that she read as genuine calculation, not anger. He was deciding. He took a step toward her. She took a step back toward the deeper shaft behind her, and her free hand found the shelf in the rock wall that she'd identified earlier, the one when she picked up the lantern. You break that, Creed said. And we're all in the dark. I know, she said. That stopped him. Because she was right, and he knew she was right, and a man who ran on leverage understood immediately when leverage shifted. They looked at each other across the shaft. Creed took a slow breath. He straightened his coat. He folded the marriage document and put it back in his pocket with the deliberateness of a man tabling a negotiation rather than ending it. "I'll give you tonight," he said. It wasn't generosity, and they both knew it. It was recalculation. Think about what you're protecting and what it's actually worth to you. He picked up his extra lantern he'd brought, too, she noticed, which told her he'd expected some version of this, and he gestured to his men, and they moved back toward the entrance. At the curve, in the tunnel, he stopped and looked back at her. "The federal officer," he said. "When he comes, and he will come, ask him to show you the original warrant, not the copy. The original, with the full authorization language." He paused. "Read the acquisition clause." Then he went around the curve, and the light from his lantern receded, and she was left with her own lantern in the dark and her father, sitting against the wall. She stood very still for a moment. The acquisition clause. She didn't know what was in it. She had the warrant. Jed had given her the copy in the gorge, but she hadn't read every line of it. She'd read her name, and the subject, and the charges, and she'd heard hoofbeats behind her, and there hadn't been time for the rest. She set the lantern back on the shelf carefully. She reached into her coat and unfolded the warrant and held it close to the light and read it fully. Every line the way she should have read it in the gorge when there was still a moment to ask questions. She found the acquisition clause on the second page. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it away and stood very quiet in the shaft, with the iron smell of old water all around her. Creed had given her the night. She intended to use it. She turned back to the shaft entrance and she began to look, methodically and without rushing, for a second way out. There wasn't one. She walked the full depth of the shaft, lantern held high, checking every branching tunnel. Two of them were collapsed. One opened into a smaller chamber that dead-ended in a wall of granite. The entrance was the only way. So the entrance it was. She came back to where Malachi sat, and she crouched against the wall beside him. Not close, but in the same orbit. She put the oilcloth parcel back in her vest pocket, and she began, quietly and systematically, to think through what she had and what she could do with it. 2 guards outside. A lantern. Her shiv partially disassembled, but not useless. The oilcloth parcel. The warrant she now wished she hadn't read. And her father, sitting beside her, who had nothing to offer, and who she had just said the truest, hardest thing to, and who had taken it with his eyes closed, and who was still breathing, and who was, despite everything, still alive. She wasn't going to wait for rescue. She had never, in 20 years, built her survival on waiting for someone else to solve the problem. She wasn't going to start in a mine shaft in Washoe County because a man with a lantern told her to think overnight about what things were worth. She knew what things were worth. She'd been doing that arithmetic her whole life. She looked at the thin slice of gray light at the entrance, and she began to plan. The blood trail wasn't hard to follow. Hester found it at the edge of the dry wash, drops on pale rock going dark in the cold air, and she followed it downslope through the brush, with her lantern low and her rifle slung across her back. She'd heard the shots from the gorge 2 hours earlier. Sound traveled clean in mountain air, and Hester Buchanan had learned long ago to pay attention to what the mountains told her. She found Jed at the bottom of the wash, wedged between 2 boulders, where the slope leveled out. He was conscious. That was the first thing. His eyes tracked to the lantern when it reached him, and he said something she couldn't make out, and she said, "Save it," and crouched down beside him. The shoulder was bad. Not the worst she'd seen, but bad enough. The bullet had gone clean through. She checked that first, entry and exit. The exit wound, larger and messier but present, which meant she didn't have to dig, and he'd lost enough blood that his coat was stiff with it on the left side. He'd packed the wound himself with what looked like a torn strip of his shirt, which had slowed things down but not stopped them. "Marin," he said, I don't know yet, Hester said. Hold still. She worked by lantern light, which she'd done before and didn't love. She cleaned the wound with the whiskey she'd brought. She always brought whiskey when she followed blood trails. A lesson from her second winter on the pass, and Jed took it without making a sound, which told her his pain tolerance was something outside the normal range. Then she packed it tight and bound it across his chest with strips of cloth she'd brought for exactly this kind of evening, because 11 years on a mountain relay station had prepared her for most versions of a bad night. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was already trying to sit up. "Give it a minute," she said. "No." He got himself upright against the boulder slowly, using his right arm. His face was gray in the lantern light. "My revolvers." "Where?" "Right here." She'd found them when she found him. One had fallen clear. The other was still in his holster. She set both within his reach and watched him check them by feel and holster them. The motion practiced enough that the bad shoulder didn't stop it. "She had the documents," he said. "When they took her, she had them." "Then they're either still with her or they're not," Hester said. "You can't do anything about that from a wash." "I need a horse. I brought two." He looked at her. Something moved through his expression that she recognized as gratitude showing up in a man who didn't have easy access to the word. "Of course you did," he said. She helped him up. That was the hard part, the ground to standing, with a shoulder that had stopped working and legs that had been sitting in cold for 2 hours. He made it. He stood there for a moment with his right hand on the boulder, and she stood close enough to catch him, if needed, and he didn't need it, which she'd expected. She handed him his hat. He'd lost it in the fall, and she'd found it 10 feet from him, crowned down in the dust. They climbed out of the wash together. Slow. She went first with the lantern, and he came behind, one-handed, not asking for help on the rocky sections, and not needing it either, which was its own kind of impressive, given the state of him. The horses were where she'd left them, ground-tied at the top of the wash. He stood at the bay's shoulder for a moment, just a moment, and she could see him calculating the mechanics of mounting with one working arm. She didn't offer. She positioned herself on his left side without comment, close enough to act as a brace if the swing-up went wrong. It didn't go wrong. It wasn't pretty, but it got done. She mounted her own horse and they rode, and she set a pace that was fast enough to matter and slow enough that he could stay in the saddle. And he stayed in it. After a while, he said, "She read the warrant." Hester looked over at him. "In the gorge, I gave it to her." He was quiet a moment. She read who was in it. Her name. Yes, Hester wrote. The mountain dark was total now, the stars doing what work they could. She knew this trail the way she knew her own hands. Every switchback, every place the ground went soft after rain. "Creed's men will have told her the rest," Jed said. "The acquisition clause. The sting language." He said it flat, without drama, just naming the thing. "She'll think the 600 was a transaction." He turned his head and looked at her. His eyes in the dark were steady. "No," he said. She believed him. She'd known Jedediah Thorne 4 years, and she'd learned to read the difference between what he said because it was true and what he said because it was convenient. And those were not always the same thing. But this was the first one. "You're going to need to say that to her," Hester said. "I know, clearly. Not the way you say things when you're hoping someone will fill in the rest." He was quiet. "Jed." "I hear you," he said. They rode in silence after that. The cabin appeared in the trees the same way it always did. The window first, yellow and steady, and Hester felt the particular relief she always felt coming home to her own light. Inside, she had him sit at the table, and she checked the bandaging by proper lamplight, and it had held well enough. She changed the packing anyway, because the first round had been emergency work, and this was the maintenance that came after. He sat through it without complaint and without the kind of performed stoicism that was its own kind of noise. He was just quiet present. Thinking she made coffee, she put a plate of cold cornbread and dried meat on the table and pushed it toward him. "Eat," she said. He picked up a piece of cornbread and ate it and drank the coffee. And after a few minutes, some of the gray came out of his face and a little color came back, and she sat across from him with her own cup, and they looked at each other across the table. "Tell me what the warrant actually says," she said. "The acquisition clause." He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and looked at it. "The authorization gave me discretionary funds to secure federal evidence, property, documents, persons of interest." He paused. The acquisition clause covered all three. "Written that way, so I had flexibility in the field. And the 600. Court funds," he said. "My investigation budget." He set the mug down. "That's what the clause covered. That's what Creed will use to argue it." But Hester said. He looked up at her. "There's a but coming," she said. "I can hear it." He breathed once. "My investigation budget was $400. I'd spent 60 of it by the time I walked into that saloon." He said it simply, like a man putting an account in order. "The 600 on that bar counter included every dollar I had left in that account, plus $220 of my own money." Hester looked at him. "That's what was in that pouch," he said, "mixed together. Federal coin and personal savings. Because the federal money wasn't enough, and I wasn't going to stand there and watch a woman get sold while I counted out what the court would cover." The fire worked in the hearth. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "Have you told anyone that?" Hester said. "I'm telling you. You need to tell her." "I know that. The law brought you to Washoe County," Hester said. "It put you in that saloon. But it didn't put your own money on that bar." She leaned forward. "That was a man making a choice. Those are different things." He nodded slowly. "Law is written on parchment," he said quietly. "But justice is whether you stand between a predator and an innocent soul." He said it like something he'd been working out for a long time, like he'd turned it over and worn it smooth and arrived at it by himself in some earlier dark before tonight. Hester held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He pushed back from the table. She saw what was coming before he said it. She'd known since they rode in. She'd been hoping the shoulder would argue him out of it, but she'd also known it wouldn't. "I need my revolvers checked, and a fresh horse. Mine's been hard used." "The bay needs a knight," she agreed. She stood up. "I've got a roan mare in the stable. She's sound, and she's fast, and she's got better sense than most men I've known." He almost smiled. It was just the edge of one, just enough to be visible. "I'll take that trade." She went to the stable and tacked the roan herself, efficiently, and when she brought her out, Jed was already at the door in his coat with his hat on, and both revolvers checked and holstered, moving with the careful economy of a man managing real pain through pure will. The left arm was held close to his side and wouldn't be much use tonight, and they both knew that, and neither of them said anything about it. She handed him the reins and held the mare's head while he mounted. Getting up was harder this time. She could see the cost of it in his face, the jaw set, the breath held, the moment at the top of the swing where the bad shoulder made its argument, and he answered it. He settled in the saddle and took a breath, and his face went quiet again. "The mining camp," he said. "Old Bennett claim, up the North Ridge." "I know it," Hester said. "I know every bad place in this county." 2 hours. She let go of the mare's head. "Go," she said. He went. The mare moved out of the yard at a trot, sure-footed in the dark, and Hester stood at the stable door and watched him go until the trees took him. She went back inside. She poured the rest of the coffee and sat at the table and looked at the empty plate and the 2 mugs and the lantern burning steady. She thought about Marin O'Shea in whatever dark she was sitting in right now, with the warrant in her pocket and Creed's version of events living in her head next to whatever she'd started to build about Jedediah Thorne over 3 days and 2 mountain passes. She thought about what it felt like to have the thing you were starting to trust revealed as something that might have been a transaction all along. She knew that feeling. She'd had a version of it a long time ago, in a different life. The arithmetic of it. The way you went back over everything and looked at it again, asking which parts were real. She'd learned eventually, that the question wasn't whether the other person's reasons were pure. Nobody's reasons were pure. People were complicated and mixed and did right things for tangled motives and wrong things with good intentions. And every story had two ledgers if you looked hard enough. The question was what the person did when they didn't have to. Jed Thorne, with a court warrant in his pocket and a $400 investigation budget, had put $220 of his own money into a leather pouch and thrown it on a bar counter because he couldn't stand what he was watching and he could do something about it. That was the thing underneath the thing. The part that the acquisition clause didn't cover. Hester hoped Marin would get the chance to hear it. She banked the fire for the second time that week with someone else on a cold trail, and she sat for a while in the warmth, and she waited. The mountains didn't say anything. They never did. But they were still there, same as always. Patient and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small human urgencies moving through them. And there was something in that, she thought. That was almost a comfort. She waited. The plan came together in pieces, the way good plans usually do. Marin had been walking the shaft for an hour before she found the cache. It was in the deepest branch, the one she'd almost dismissed, because the ceiling dropped low and the air went bad fast. She'd held the lantern at arm's length and pushed in anyway, and there it was, 3 crates stacked against the back wall, the wood old and soft but intact. And when she pried the corner of the top one up, with the thin edge of the disassembled tin from her shiv, she smelled it immediately. Black powder, old, probably left by whatever operation had abandoned this shaft. But dry, which was the thing that mattered. The rock above had kept the water out of this pocket, and the powder had sat in the dark for however many years, patient and still, and waiting for someone to find a use for it. She stood there with the lantern and looked at the crates and thought it through. 2 guards at the entrance. Creed and his men somewhere above at the camp. One way out. She needed a diversion. She needed it loud enough to pull the guards away from the entrance and complicated enough to keep them busy for more than 30 seconds. She needed it to go where she aimed it, not where the tunnel happened to direct it. She'd watched her mother use black powder once, clearing a tree stump on the eastern ridge. Cora had packed it tight, capped it, run the fuse along the ground, and stood back. The stump had come out of the earth in 3 large pieces and a cloud of dirt, and Cora had watched it settle with her arms crossed and said, simply, "That's physics, Marin. It does what it's going to do. You just have to point it right." She started thinking about how to point it right. Malachi came to stand at the entrances of the branch tunnel. He looked at the crates. He looked at her. "Is that what I think it is?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "What are you going to do with it?" "Get us out of here," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Tell me what to do." She looked at him. His voice had something in it she didn't remember hearing, often no performance in it, no salesman's lilt. Just a man asking a plain question. "There's a secondary crack in the south wall," she said, "about 30 feet back toward the entrance. I need the loose rock cleared from the base of it." Quietly, he nodded and went. She spent the next 40 minutes working. She packed the powder carefully into 2 concentrations, the larger one deep in the branch tunnel, angled toward the shaft ceiling, where the granite had already fractured along a natural seam. The second one she positioned near the main shaft wall, closer to the entrance curve, tight against a timber support that had been rotting for years. Not enough to bring the tunnel down on anyone. Enough to make a very large amount of noise, and enough to take out the support timber, which would send a section of the outer tunnel wall into the entrance corridor and block it from the outside. Block it from the outside was the key part. Fuse was the problem. She didn't have proper fuse. She thought about it, walked back to where Malachi was clearing rock, looked at what they had between them. His coat had a long wool lining he'd half torn on the way in. She had the oilcloth from her vest pocket, which she needed for the documents. She had the canvas strips she'd been using to pad the rock surface where she sat. Canvas soaked in the lamp oil that was left in the lantern reservoir. She'd get one shot at this. She needed to time it right. She worked the wick out of the lantern base and used the reservoir oil. There wasn't much, half an inch to saturate 2 strips of canvas, each about 2 feet long. She twisted each one tight and laid them as fuses, trailing back from the powder concentrator toward the main shaft, far enough that she'd have 30 seconds, maybe 40. 30 seconds to get to the entrance. She went and found Malachi. "When I light this," she said, "you run straight to the entrance, through it, and you keep going up the slope to the right. Don't stop, and don't look back. Understand?" He looked at the fuses, looked at her. "What about the guards? The guards are going to have other things to think about." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "Marin." She was already turning back to the powder. "I know," he said. "That sorry doesn't fix it." "I know that." He stopped. "But I need to say it anyway. For me, not for you. Because you were right about everything you said. And I've known it for a long time. And saying it out loud to your face is the only honest thing I've got left." She held still. She didn't turn around. "All right," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't warmth. But it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the most honest currency she had. And she gave him what was real. Then she crouched at the near fuse and struck the match. The canvas caught. Both fuses at once. She moved fast between them, and then she was moving. Malachi ahead of her. Both of them running the 40 feet to the entrance curve in the dark. Because she'd left the lantern at the powder, and she knew this tunnel by memory now, every uneven section of floor, every low beam. She hit the entrance curve at a full run. The guards heard them coming. Of course they did. She'd expected that. One of them turned and started to raise his rifle, and she went straight at him, which was the last thing he expected, and she dropped her shoulder and hit him in the chest. And they both went down in the dirt outside the entrance, and his rifle went one way, and she went the other, and she rolled and came up running. Behind her, the mountain said something enormous. The first detonation hit the granite seam, and the sound of it was beyond loud, it was physical. A pressure wave that pushed the air out of the tunnel entrance and knocked dust off the cliff face above them and sent both guards staggering. The second came 2 seconds later and took the support timber, and the entrance corridor made a grinding roar as the outer wall folded in on itself, and a cloud of gray-white dust came rolling out of the opening like something alive. Creed's men at the camp above were shouting. She could hear them up the slope. Malachi was already moving right, the way she'd told him. Marin went left. The camp was a collection of rough structures, 2 timber shacks, an old mine office, a corral with 6 horses set into a natural shelf on the slope above the shaft entrance. She'd seen it when they brought her in, filed it away. She'd counted the horses and noted the tack hanging outside the corral fence. She needed a horse. She also needed the gunfire that was now starting from the shacks to be pointed somewhere other than at her. It got pointed somewhere other than at her. The first shot came from the tree line on the west side of the camp, clean and precise, and took out the lantern hanging outside the left shack. Dark, suddenly, on that side. The second shot came from slightly higher and further left, and she understood immediately what he was doing. Moving between shots, never firing twice from the same position, making himself impossible to locate, while the men in the camp spun looking for a source. Jed. She didn't stop to process how he was here. She ran for the corral. 3 of Creed's men came out of the right shack and spread into the camp, moving toward the tree line. 2 more came out of the mine office, higher up the slope. That left 1 man she could see near the corral. And he was watching the tree line, too, rifle up, looking for muzzle flash. She came up behind him. She had the shiv, just the hairpin now. Not much of a weapon, but she didn't need a weapon. She needed noise. She grabbed a tin bucket off the corral fence and threw it hard against the water trough. The man spun. She was already through the corral gate. She had a sorrel mare, saddled, and out of the corral in 45 seconds. It wasn't graceful, and the mare didn't love it, But they moved, and she cleared the corral gate at a run and swung right along the tree line, staying low, moving fast. Gunshots behind her. None of them close. Creed's voice, somewhere up by the mine office, hard and loud, calling his men to regroup. She pulled the mare up inside the tree line and looked back. The camp was lit by one remaining lantern, throwing long shadows across the packed dirt. She could see 3 of Creed's men near the shacks. 2 more were still moving through the trees on the far side, looking for Jed's position. Then she saw Creed. He came down from the mine office with 2 men flanking him, and he walked through the camp with that same deliberate, unhurried motion he always had, adjusting his coat, scanning the tree line. He saw the open corral gate. He understood what it meant. He turned and looked directly at the tree line where she was. He couldn't see her. She knew that. But he knew the angles, and he was smart, and he'd already done the math. "Miss O'Shea," he called out. His voice carried clean through the cold mountain air. "You've had your demonstration. You've shown me you're resourceful." He stopped walking. "But you're in a mountain camp with 1 horse and no weapons, and 5 of my men are still standing. I have the gunfighter's position, and I'll have him in 10 minutes. He paused. "Come out now, and we can still discuss terms. Wait, and we won't be discussing anything." Jed's rifle cracked from a completely different position than the one Creed's men were watching. The lantern went out. Full dark. She heard Creed's men scrambling, heard him snap orders, heard boots on packed dirt, moving fast, the kind of fast that meant the situation had stopped being controlled. She pushed the mare forward. Jed found her at the edge of the camp, coming out of the dark on the roan mare she recognized from Hester's stable. He was riding with one hand. She saw that immediately left arm, held tight against his body, right hand on the reins. His face in the dark was drawn and set. He pulled up beside her, and for 1 second, they just looked at each other. And she had 1,000 things in her, and none of them had words yet. So she said nothing, and he said nothing. And they both turned and pushed the horses into the trees. They were 50 yards out when she heard Creed behind them, back at the camp, reorganizing. Then she heard something else. A voice, Malachi's, from somewhere to the right, thin and strained, and unmistakably her father calling for help. She pulled the mare up hard. Jed pulled up beside her. He'd heard it too. "He went right," she said. "I told him to go right." Jed was already turning the roan. They found Malachi 20 yards up a boulder field, sitting against a rock with his leg at an angle that explained why he'd stopped moving. He'd gone down on the loose shale in the dark. His face, when the starlight hit it, was white and tight. "Go," he said when he saw them. "Leave me. I'm not asking you to." "Stop talking," Marin said. She was already off the mare. Jed swung down from the roan, one-handed, and between them they got Malachi up and onto the roan's back. He made a sound that he tried to suppress and didn't manage it. The leg was bad. She didn't look at it closely, because there wasn't time, and because looking at it wasn't going to help right now. She put Jed back on the mare with her. He sat behind her, right arm coming around to take the reins, because his right hand worked and hers needed to be free. She didn't argue with the logic. They moved. The tree line ran north along the slope, and she didn't know this terrain the way she knew the valley below, but she knew elevation, and she knew that down was always an option when up wasn't. She picked a line through the pines by feel, by the way the ground fell, by the sound of water somewhere below them that meant a drainage, and a drainage meant a trail. Behind them she could hear horses leaving the camp. Creed's voice again, closer than it should have been. She couldn't make out the words. The trees thinned ahead. A clearing. She almost pulled up, and then she saw it wasn't just a clearing. It was the derelict mining camp the outline of the land had suggested. The old Bennett operation, 3 structures, half collapsed, the head frame of the main shaft still standing against the blood-red light of the sky where the sun was finally going down behind the western peaks. She didn't know why. She hadn't seen the sunset coming. She'd been underground. It was extraordinary, actually. The whole western sky burning copper and dark red. the mountain faces catching it and throwing it back. The old camp lit up in that dying light, like something out of a painting. She had about 30 seconds to think it was beautiful before Creed rode into the clearing behind them. He came out of the trees with 2 men flanking him, and he came fast, which told her his patience had run out, and he pulled up hard when he saw them stopped at the far side of the clearing. His eyes moved across the scene, Malachi on the roan, barely upright, Jed behind her on the mare, her in front, without a weapon he could see. He reached into his coat and came out with his Colt. "Off the horses," he said. "Both of you now." Jed didn't move. Marin didn't move. Creed cocked the hammer. "I'm past negotiating, Miss O'Shea. I want those documents, and I want them now. And I'm done being civilized about it." She reached into her vest pocket. His eyes tracked to her hand, and his expression shifted toward satisfaction, and she pulled out not the oilcloth parcel, but the warrant, the federal court document. She held it up so he could see it in the dying light. "This says you're the subject of a federal fraud investigation," she said. "Shooting a federal commissioner and the primary witness in that investigation in an open field, with 2 of your own men watching, makes you a murderer. In a federal court, there's no county deal that covers that." Creed looked at her. His expression said he knew she was right, and he was angry about it, and his anger was looking for somewhere to go. "Get off the horses," he said again. She started to answer, and then Malachi slid off the roan. He didn't fall. That was the thing. He chose it. He came down off the horse deliberately and landed hard on the bad leg, and she heard his breath go out, and he straightened, and he walked forward into the clearing between her and Creed's gun. Creed stared at him. "Malachi," he said, "get out of the—" "I owe you money," Malachi said. His voice was rough and tired and completely without the salesman's lilt. "I've owed you money for 2 years, and I've owed her a great deal longer than that." He stopped walking about 10 feet from Creed's horse. "I'm not much. I know that. I've known it for a while." He paused. "But I'm her father, and that gun's not going to point at her while I'm standing." Creed's 2 men looked at each other. Creed looked at Malachi the way a man looks at a variable he didn't account for. Then he shifted the Colt toward Malachi instead. Marin moved. She came off the mare and hit the ground and was already running when she heard Creed fire, and the sound of it was enormous in the clearing. And she heard her father make a sound, and then she heard a second shot immediately after, from her right. Jed. She turned. Creed's Colt was on the ground. He was holding his right hand against his chest, not shot through it, but the gun was gone, knocked clean from his grip, which was the kind of shot that required more than a good eye. It required a specific understanding of exactly what you were shooting at and exactly how much force would do the job you wanted. Creed's 2 men went very still. Malachi was on the ground. She crossed to him fast and dropped beside him. The bullet had taken him in the left side, just below the ribs. Bad, but she'd seen her mother treat worse. She pressed both hands against it and looked at his face. He was looking back at her. "That was stupid," she said. "Probably," he said. His right hand moved. He reached into his coat, slow, with obvious effort, and pulled out a folded paper. His deed. She recognized the format she'd seen enough of them in the Silver Peak Records room. His hand was shaking when he held it out. She took it. It was a deed disclaimer. Handwritten, poorly spelled, but legally structured. She could see the structure of it, the clauses, the intent. He was disclaiming any and all interest in the Whitfield O'Shea silver claim. No contest to her ownership. No secondary claim through marriage or inheritance. At the bottom, in the dirt and the fading light, he pressed his blood-stained thumb to the paper beside his signature. "First honest thing I've done in a long time," he said. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She kept her hands on the wound and looked at him and said, "Don't move." Behind her she heard Jed's voice, quiet and final, telling Creed's 2 men to drop their rifles and sit down. She heard the rifles hit the dirt. She heard the men sit. Jed came and crouched beside her. He looked at Malachi's side clinically, the same way she'd looked at his shoulder in the gorge. He reached into his coat and came out with a cloth, and she held it while he pressed it into place. "He needs a doctor," Jed said. "I know that. There's a settlement 2 miles north. Real doctor, not a barber." She looked at him. He was pale and worn down to something essential, the bad shoulder making itself known in every line of his face. And he was still here, still working the problem, still functioning. She thought about the acquisition clause. She thought about $220 of his own money. She thought about his back, turned in the dark, 10 paces away, all night. She didn't have the words for it yet. They'd come later, when she had room. "Right now," she said. "Can you ride another 2 miles?" "Yes," he said. She believed him. Creed was standing at the edge of the clearing, right hand still held to his chest, the last of the red sky behind him. His 2 men sat in the dirt. His operation, his mountain, his county, all of it balanced on the edge of something that had already tipped. He looked at Marin across the clearing. "This isn't finished," he said. "It is," she said. "You just don't know it yet." She went back to her father and helped him up, and Jed brought the roan around, and they got Malachi into the saddle between them with effort and care, and the particular, unglamorous work of keeping a wounded man moving, when moving is the only option. The sun finished setting. The mountains went dark blue and then gray, and then the stars came in. The same stars that had been above Nevada the night she'd ridden out of Oakhaven on an Appaloosa with her wrists burning, and nothing ahead of her but open ground. She rode north. Jed rode beside her. The clearing fell behind them, with Creed still standing in it, and the old camp and the head frame and the blood-red sky, all of it already becoming the past, already becoming something that had happened, rather than something that was happening. She held the reins, and she rode, and she breathed the cold mountain air, and the deed disclaimer was in her pocket, and the oilcloth parcel was in her vest, and her father was alive, and the man beside her was alive, and the stars above Nevada were the same impossible depth they'd always been, dense and cold and real. She rode toward the settlement and the doctor and whatever came after. She kept going. The Sacramento courthouse smelled like cedar oil and old paper. Marin sat in the third row, hands folded in her lap, watching the federal commissioner read the sentencing. She'd been in this room for 3 days. 3 days of testimony, exhibits, certified copies laid flat on the evidence table, her copies, the ones she and Aldous had made together in that records room in Silver Peak, while Creed's men stood on the street corners watching. Clement Voss had testified on day 2. He'd come in pale and small, a different man than the one who'd stamped fraudulent documents for Bat Creed's operation over 3 years. His lawyer had negotiated the terms beforehand. Full testimony in exchange for reduced charges. He sat in that chair and told the court, in a voice that cracked twice, exactly how the transfers had been filed, whose idea it was, how much he'd been paid. Marin had listened to every word. She hadn't felt triumphant. She'd felt her mother. Cora O'Shea had never seen the inside of a courtroom. She'd pressed a surveyor's rod into Nevada ground and written a deed in her careful leftward slanting hand and hidden it under a false bottom in a cedar chest, because she understood, by the end, that the law could protect her or devour her, depending entirely on whether anyone bothered to read it closely enough. Marin had read it closely enough. The commissioner's voice filled the room now, measured and flat. Bartholomew Creed stood at the front with his lawyer beside him, dressed well as always, still wearing that coat. He didn't turn around. He didn't look at the gallery. The sentence came down. Federal hard labor, 7 years for fraud, coercion, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of property rights under federal statute. 2 of his enforcers received lesser terms. Mayor Theodore Marsh was already awaiting a separate proceeding. 7 years. Marin breathed once, slow, and looked at her hands. Jed was seated to her left. His left arm was in a sling. The shoulder was healing. The doctor in the settlement had done good work, but it needed time, and he hadn't given it much. He sat straight anyway. He always sat straight. She felt him look at her when the sentence was read, She didn't turn immediately. She let it settle first. Let the room breathe around it. Then she looked at him. His expression was the same one she'd learned to read over 2 weeks and 2 mountain passes. Quiet, present, not performing anything. She nodded once. He nodded back. Creed was escorted out. The gallery began to move. Papers shuffled. Voices rose. The ordinary noise of a room returning to itself after something significant had passed through it. Marin stayed, seated. The clerk came to her 20 minutes later with a document she'd been waiting on since before Silver Peak, the title certificate. Full unencumbered ownership of the Whitfield O'Shea silver claim. Probate properly filed, legal transfer executed in her name alone. She read it twice, every line, the way her mother had taught her. Then she folded it and put it in her coat. Outside the courthouse, Sacramento was going about its afternoon. The river caught the light and threw it back, white and gold, and the streets were loud with wagons and commerce and the particular ambitious noise of a city that hadn't decided yet how big it was going to get. Jed came to stand beside her on the courthouse steps. She reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. She'd prepared it the night before at the boarding house, by lamplight, working through the arithmetic twice to make sure it was right. Inside was a bank draft. $600 plus 3 weeks of daily wages calculated at the rate a federal commissioner was paid for field work. She held it out to him. He looked at it, looked at her. "Take it," she said. He took the envelope. He opened it. He read the draft the way she'd read the title certificate, completely, not skimming. Then he looked up. "Marin, I know what the acquisition clause said," she told him. "I know the federal money covered part of it. I know you put your own savings in that pouch, and I know why you haven't told me that directly, because you're the kind of man who does the right thing and then doesn't want credit for it." She paused. "But I need to do this. You hear me? I need to clear it." He was quiet. "I give you this," she said. "So no ghost of a transaction stands between us. If we ride together from this day forward, it must be as two free people choosing a partnership, not an obligation." The river moved. A cart horse clattered past on the cobblestones below them. Somewhere down the block, a woman was laughing at something, loud and genuine. Jed looked at the bank draft for another moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat. He looked at her, and something in his face opened up, not wide, not theatrical, just enough. The weariness still there, the weight he always carried, but underneath it, something that had been held back a long time finally allowed to be present. "Where to, Marin?" he said. She felt it land. The same question, the same voice, the same unhurried patience it had carried. That first night in Oakhaven, when she'd been standing on an upturned barrel with rope burns on her wrists, and no plan beyond away from here. She looked at him steadily. "To whatever ground lets us walk side by side," she said. He held her gaze. Then slowly he smiled. A real one. She'd seen the edge of it before, in pieces, but this was the whole thing, and it was quieter than she expected, and warmer than she'd prepared for. She looked out at the river. They stood there together, on the courthouse steps in the Sacramento afternoon, and neither of them said anything else, and it was enough. Spring came to the Sacramento Valley, the way it always did, without asking permission, just arriving one morning with warm air and the smell of turned earth and the particular green that existed nowhere else on the continent. Marin noticed it in early March, riding the fence line on the eastern edge of the property. The hills were already going gold at the tops where the grass dried fast, but in the low ground near the creek, everything was vivid and new, and the creek itself was running high from snowmelt in the mountains, rushing over the smooth stones with that sound that was, in her opinion, one of the best sounds in the world. The ranch had taken most of the fall and winter to get right. She'd used the silver claim, proceeds carefully, the way her mother would have, not fast, not recklessly, but not timidly either. She'd paid for good fencing, sound buildings, a barn that would stand. She'd hired 2 hands who knew what they were doing, and paid them fairly, which in her experience was the simplest way to have people who showed up and did the work. The schoolhouse she'd built herself. That wasn't entirely true. Jed had built most of it, one-handed for the first 6 weeks while the shoulder finished healing, and he hadn't complained once, but she'd designed it. She knew what it needed to be. One large room, good windows for light, a shelf of books along the west wall, a chalkboard at the front, and a long table with benches down the middle. On the wall beside the door, she'd hung 2 things, a copy of the Married Women's Property Act and a map of Nevada with her mother's claim marked in red ink, not for decoration, for instruction. She taught 3 mornings a week. The students were whoever showed up children from the neighboring farms, 2 women who'd come west with their husbands and found themselves running operations they hadn't been prepared for, an older man named Cyrus who wanted to be able to read his own land contracts and was embarrassed it had taken him this long to ask. She'd told Cyrus the same thing she told everyone. Her mother had learned to read deeds in her 40s. There was no wrong time. She covered reading and writing and basic arithmetic, but she covered other things too. Property law, what a deed was and how to file one, what a probate proceeding required, which statutes protected married women's property in California, and which ones still needed fighting. She kept it plain and direct, no jargon, no ceremony, just the information, clearly stated. Because information was the thing nobody had given her until her mother hid it in a cedar chest for her to find. She wasn't going to hide it. Jed ran the ranch. He'd handed in his federal commissioner's designation the week they arrived in Sacramento, formally and without drama, in a letter he'd written at the boarding house desk in 2 drafts. He hadn't explained it to her in detail. He didn't need to. She'd watched him do it and understood. The work that had brought him to Washoe County was done, and the work that came next was this, and he'd made his choice. He was good at it. Better than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure why she'd expected otherwise. He knew horses and land and equipment, and he worked with the same economy. He did everything. Nothing wasted. The 2 hands respected him. He was fair and clear, and didn't raise his voice. Some evenings he sat on the porch and read. She'd discovered, sometime around November, that he read a great deal history mostly, some law, occasionally poetry, which had surprised her and then hadn't. He had the kind of mind that liked things to be exact, and poetry at its best was exact, in ways that other writing wasn't. She'd started leaving books out that she thought he'd like. He'd started doing the same for her. They didn't talk about it. It was just a thing they did. On a Thursday in late April, Erin was finishing a reading lesson on the porch when she saw Jed come around the side of the barn and stop at the corral fence. He did that sometimes, in the evenings leaned against it, and watched the horses and let the day settle out of him. She wrapped up the lesson. The children gathered their slates and their things, chattering in the way. Children did. At the end of something, the energy of confinement suddenly released. She said goodbye to each of them by name. She watched them head down the road toward their respective farms. Then she came down the porch steps and walked across the yard to where Jed was standing. The light was going gold at the edges, the way it did this time of year, the sun hitting the mountains to the east and throwing it all back warm and long. The horses moved slow in the corral. The creek was audible from here, that good rushing sound. She stopped beside him and looked out at the same thing he was looking at. Neither of them spoke for a while. They'd both learned, over the months, that silence between them wasn't empty. It was just quiet. There was a difference. Malachi was in Sacramento. He'd survived the bullet barely, and the doctor had been honest with him about how close it had been. He'd spent 2 months recovering at a boarding house Marin had paid for, and then he'd found work at a livery, stable, quiet work, tending horses. She'd visited twice. They'd talked, both times, in the plain way she'd learned to talk to him, no performances on either side. No old scripts, just what was true. It wasn't warmth exactly. It wasn't the father-daughter thing she'd wanted when she was younger, and still thought wanting it was possible. But it was honest, and honest was what she had to offer. And he was taking it. That was something. Jed shifted beside her. His shoulder had healed completely by February, and she'd stopped tracking whether he favored it weeks ago because he didn't anymore. He was watching the Appaloosa cross the corral. That big spotted horse, moving easy in the last of the light. He turned and looked at her. She felt it before she saw it. That specific attention of his, the kind that was fully present and fully still, the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. He reached out and put his arms around her waist, gentle, no hurry to it. She let him. She turned into it and put her hand against his chest over his heart and felt it there. Steady, real, present. His voice came quiet close to her ear. "Where to?" She smiled. She didn't move. She felt the evening air and the warmth of him, and the sound of the creek and the horses, and somewhere down the road, the last of the children still, talking as they walked home, their voices going thin with distance. She pressed her hand a little firmer against his chest. "Right here," she said. The sun dropped behind the mountains. The valley went blue and soft. The first stars showed up, the way they always did, one at a time. Then all at once the same stars that had been above Nevada the night she'd ridden out of Oak Haven into the dark. Not knowing what came next, only knowing she was going. She knew now. She was here. She'd chosen it, the same way Hester had chosen her mountain, the same way her mother had chosen a piece of Nevada ground and pressed a rod into it and said, "This is real. This is mine. I claim this." She'd claimed this. Jed held her in the evening light on the ranch they'd built together, and neither of them said anything more because nothing else needed saying. The stars multiplied overhead. The creek ran on. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters and events are imaginary and bear no resemblance to any real person or actual occurrence.